Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Offshore Wind Workshop. Tony, you're going to change your name tag because I'm going to keep calling you Mel Bell. Anyway, thanks for everyone for coming to this. My name's Jim Gilmore. I'm the current chairman of the ASMFC, and I'm also the administrative commissioner for New York. And with me today is Mike Pentney from NOAA Fisheries in Garfo, and we're going to co-chair this today and move this along. But I think before we get started, we'll probably go around the room because I think there's some folks that maybe don't know each other. So let me go to the left, Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jason McNamee, Chief of Marine Fisheries for Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management.
Eric Reed, Legislative Proxy for the State of Rhode Island.
John Quinn, Massachusetts, Chairman of the New England Fisheries Council.
Dan McKiernan, Mass DMF Deputy Director.
Raymond Kane, Massachusetts Governor's appointee.
Justin Davis, Head of Marine Fisheries for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
Joe Cimino, New Jersey DEP, Marine Fisheries Administrator.
Tony Delaney, New York, member of Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council.
Brian Plumley, Virginia GA.
Bonnie Mason, Virginia Senate.
Mike Luisi, Maryland Department of Natural Resources and Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council Chair.
Stu Mickles, Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife, Program Manager, Marine Fisheries.
Hi, I'm Meredith Mendelson. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Marine Resources in Maine.
I'm Julia Beatty. I'm staff with the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, sitting in for my boss, Dr. Chris Moore.
Hi, I'm Bob Beal, Executive Director of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission.
Andy Lipsky with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, NOAA Fisheries.
And Tony Kern's on lead mic. So she's going to take all the notes and make sure we stay on time. So just a little background before we get going. This actually was born out of the NRCC meeting a few months ago down in South Carolina. And during that meeting, we got into a discussion about offshore wind, and it became apparent how many projects were coming down the road and how many states were doing independent efforts. And NOAA Fisheries talking about that they were also doing a lot of effort on this. So it became apparent that maybe there were some efficiencies we could do if we got together and talked about it. So, and Mike graciously agreed to set up this workshop. So appreciate it, Mike, because I think it was definitely hopefully it's going to be worth its while. There's just a lot of things what we'll get into as we go through the presentations, but my concern at the time was that in New York we've done a big commitment to offshore wind, but I have existing staff that I'm using to address it, and there's just a whole lot of issues going on that I'm trying to get more staff on, quite frankly, but I know it seemed the other states were struggling with the same issue. And things about how we're going to be doing permitting, how we're going to be doing research, what the towers mean, so on and so forth. So instead of each state doing, a separate effort on this, and maybe the federal government, it made more sense if we can maybe coordinate our efforts, including, and from the state perspective, there's a unique jurisdictional perspective of this because most of I think all of them are out in federal waters, so in federal jurisdiction, but we have all state fishermen that are fishing in those areas. And then we also have transmission lines that will be coming into our states, and so we have some jurisdiction, and maybe other jurisdictions. Our Department of State has jurisdiction in front of CZM, but so it's a kind of a complicated jurisdictional whole effort. So anyway, that's the purpose today, is really to discuss what we're all doing, and Mike's going to go into more detail now about it, but please, everybody jump in, and really hopefully we can get a more efficient process at the end of the day. So thanks, and over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I appreciate everybody sticking around for this meeting. As Jim said, this came out of a question and an idea at our Northeast Region Coordinating Council, or NRCC, meeting in May, and where we had a brief update kind of on the status and progress on some wind energy projects just among the NRCC leadership. And realized that there was a knowledge and information gap among some of the states, and so Jim gave me credit. I really give Bob Beal and the commission staff credit for pulling this together in conjunction with the meeting this week. The real purpose and what I hope to accomplish today is to just get a better understanding from our perspective and among all of the states present here for how wind energy may affect the various states, and particularly in terms of coordination and engagement among the state fishery management agencies. The point that Jim mentioned that was raised at the NRCC meeting that kind of prompted this was that the level of awareness and engagement on wind issues really differs among the states. Massachusetts and Rhode Island are highly engaged, but other states may not be as engaged and aware at the same level that those two states are. We NIMS have been working very closely with Rhode Island and Massachusetts on a lot of these issues, but we haven't yet really engaged with New York or New Jersey or some of the other states as well. Did think it would be useful to have this forum as a commission meeting versus a standalone meeting. For one thing, a lot of you are already here, and we can reach a lot of people that are engaged in the fishery management process within the states and among the states, but that wouldn't necessarily come to yet another wind meeting if we scheduled it as a standalone wind meeting. So we thought there was a benefit to having it in conjunction with the commission, as well as the fact that just leveraging the availability of the space and all the meeting logistics that commission staff were able to do. One of the things that we've learned over the last year or so, as we've been getting more engaged and more involved on this, is that there are real and meaningful differences among the states in terms of the governance structures and organizations of the states, in terms of where does the fishery management agency, for example, sit relative to the coastal zone management agency and the energy department, who all have a role in this process and are all engaged at different levels. And so one of the things we hope to learn today is to better understand those differences among the states, and how we can then, understanding those differences, make sure that we're engaging with the right people at the right level at the right times on these issues. Tony, can you throw up that map? So as I mentioned, obviously Rhode Island and Massachusetts have been watching and participating in this very closely due to the fact that there are some projects pretty far along right off their coasts. But as this map shows, and I'm going to come back to this in my actual presentation a little bit later on specific roles and responsibilities. This is a map of all of the known and proposed lease areas that up and down the coast. And as you can see, they span all the way down to Georgia, and up off the coast of every state here has at least one colored box off its coast. Now, yes, they are all in federal waters, but as fishery management agencies, we are all responsible for managing not just the resources that cross our jurisdictions within state waters and federal waters, and then obviously the commission, the shared stocks, but also we engage with and we manage the fishing activity that may or may not be constrained or affected in some way by wind energy development as it progresses. And so all of us here have a stake in the decisions that are made regarding wind energy, and we have a stake in understanding how those decisions may or may not affect both the resources we are charged with managing and the fishing industries and fishing communities that look to us for leadership and management. So, the focus today really is on improving the awareness among all of the states, particularly the process for how we review potential impacts, and what the agency's role in providing input to the action agency, which is BOEM within the Department of Interior, and then how the state agencies can engage, the state fishery management agencies in particular, can engage with BOEM and with NIMS to make sure that we're all using the best information, that we're interpreting it correctly, and that we're using it to truly understand the potential impacts where and when those may occur. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll stop and we can move on to the next item.
Okay, first off, let me start at the table. Is there any questions in terms of what we have on the agenda or the process, if we're pretty much clear on where we're going with this, or if we're missing anything from anybody's perspective at this point? Seeing none, and just following commission tradition, we do offer public comments. So if anyone in the public has a comment before we get into this, I'd entertain it now. Again, it's stuff maybe we missed on the agenda. Okay, well, seeing none, first order of business is we're going to get into a presentation by Andy Lipsky. You're going to lead us into the discussion and hopefully stimulate a lot of conversation. So, Andy, take it away.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mike, Commission members, for inviting myself and Northeast Fisheries Science Center to be here today and talk about this important topic. So Tony's advancing the slides. I'm pretending to on my computer so I can see what slides we're on. So if I get confused, you know what's happening. So in terms of the outline, I'll talk very briefly of rapid expansion of offshore wind, where we're at, similar to what Mike had mentioned. That'll be very brief. And the majority of this presentation will just be talking about sort of the interactions with offshore wind space with the NOAA Fisheries scientific mission, some key challenges that we're facing now, key opportunities, and some conclusions as well. So that's sort of what we're in for over the next 20 minutes or so. Thank you. Next slide. I'm going to start this conversation that we're trying to achieve a marine environment that is not offshore wind or fisheries, sustainable fisheries. We're looking at how do we coexist together so it's fisheries and offshore wind, and how do we responsibly develop and advance sustainable renewable energy as we responsibly manage and advance sustainable fisheries and bringing food to our table. So both of these are renewable energy sources that are critically important. This issue, as our director John here keeps saying, this is a rest of our careers issue for us. We're about to embark on a very large-scale effort to develop offshore renewable energy. And you'll see in the maps across the Northwest Atlantic. First, the Pacific is entertaining leasing in the Pacific Islands as well. And these projects are large-scale. They will be in the water for decades. I think the lifespan of a turbine is about 20 years before they go into a decommissioning phase. So we're in this really excellent place where, other than a pilot project in Rhode Island, we have an ability to think and apply all the lessons that we've learned from our management of natural resources and apply it to this design problem. How can we develop responsible offshore energy and sustain critical fisheries and habitats that are important to the United States? It's going to require us working together to do that. Essentially, this is my punchline for this whole talk, is coexistence. This is the rest of our careers. Whether you want to be doing it or not, it's here. And in order to do it effectively, we're going to have to work together and be collaborative and be creative. Next slide, please. Mike already presented this. BOEM, just for the, BOEM is our lead federal agency decision maker for offshore energy planning, development, and management. Mike is going to present sort of the marine fisheries authorities and sort of where we intersect in the process, and I'm going to stay well away from that. So next slide, please. So in terms of the rest of our careers, and some of these dates may have change. It seems like every week there's changes in sort of procurement processes or announcements, so these slides become out of date pretty quickly. But we've got planned projects in the pipeline for construction, at least the ones that are real right now, extending into 2027 for the next 20 years. This list through 2027 of construction activity does not include any new lease areas that are planned, such as a New York Bight or potential activity up in the Gulf of Maine. And relative to Gulf of Maine, et cetera, this does not include potential activities associated with moored technology. So everything that's being developed now are fixed to the seafloor, and the engineering, although it's changing day by day in terms of the technology of developing wind, there's a limitation to the depth of water that the fixed turbine footings can be placed in now. But that depth constraint goes away when we're developing floating offshore turbines. So this list does not include the potential for that type of development. Again, this is the rest of our careers issue. Next slide, please. So wind development intersects with our NOAA Fisheries enterprise, across basically everything that we do at NOAA Fisheries in the Science Center, managing and providing science to understand what's happening in our fishing communities, understanding our fisheries themselves, conducting assessments, understanding habitat, conducting large-scale ecosystem surveys to produce understanding of what's happening to our nation's climate and oceans, our marine mammals. Mike will be going into sort of the authorities that intersect with these mission areas, because we do science in support of management. Endangered species, such as North Atlantic right whales, essential fish habitat. Aquaculture is another area of that NOAA Fisheries works in, although we do not have commercial scale offshore aquaculture in marine waters. That concept is being advanced. That will intersect with the development of offshore wind. They will actually share probably some of the same challenges associated with developing those uses sustainably. And our mission area of advancing marine ecosystem management intersects with offshore wind energy. So offshore wind intersects with everything that the NOAA Fisheries mission is involved in, and we're statutorily required to address. Next slide, please. In terms of our history of working in this space, we've worked collaboratively with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for actually a number of years, helping and participating in efforts to better understand these areas so that planning and decision making can be informed with the best available information. We've conducted fishing revenue studies, such in the New York Bight area. We've provided analyses on the amount of landings and value of landings associated within some of the New York Bight call areas, and provided socioeconomic impact assessments across the Northeast Shelf as planning information. We've conducted habitat characterization studies of all at least the Northeast wind energy areas. Our Atlantic Marine Assessment of Protected Species, I always get the AMAPS acronym wrong, but that's a large-scale aerial and vessel-based survey program that started in 2010, and it's in partnership with BOEM, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Department of Defense, where we do large-scale surveys of marine mammals, sea turtles, and seabirds, seabird surveys. Those have been ongoing since 2010, and that information and data has been brought to and utilized in many of the planning and decision-making processes. And we only recently we've been funded by BOEM Environmental Studies Program to conduct lab-based experimental studies on the impact of sound. We have a project with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute looking at sound impacts on behavior of black sea bass and longfin squid. So we have been involved in this space, but it has been as sort of not necessarily ad hoc per se, but these have been side projects that we've developed, basically since 2010. And the other part of our intersection with this space is we've got, one of the most data-rich environments in largely the planet in the Northwest Atlantic, with 50 years of survey effort on the Northeast. And so we have a lot of information and data available in long-term time series as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of other interactions before we have construction, when we do have construction or decommissioning, these are the types of effects that we have identified or as things that we need to pay attention to or care about. And this largely exists from the 20-year history from the European experience, because Europe has been developing offshore energy, largely in the last 20 years, with a lot more development over the last 5 years or so. So some of the issues or effects, and it's important that I'm using the word effect here, not impact, because in many of these cases we don't necessarily know what the impacts will be, and that's why scientific understanding of the construction, operation, and decommissioning of these projects is really, really important. But the types of effects that we care about, we know that our drivers to our trust responsibilities would be the seafloor disturbance, sediment suspension and deposition during construction, the dredging and cabling effort to bury the submarine cables connecting the landfalls to the offshore wind turbine areas, noise effects both from the pile driving to secure the base foundations of these very large structures, to the vessel traffic during construction, lighting effects during construction, and also during construction the displacement of fishing effort. Next slide. In terms of operations, the types of effects that we're very interested in understanding and to address relative to our trust responsibilities, again, is see not just what's happening in the benthic environment, whether it's the burial submarine cables or the footings of the structures, but water column disturbance. The photo I have on the right is a NASA image of, I believe it's the Thanet Array, the London Array in Europe, and you can see that we have, this is a very different environment than maybe where we're going to be developing wind turbines, but this is a fine grain sediment material that's being distributed due to tidal force velocities. And I don't know if in the back you can see the plumes of this, but we have sediment plumes behind each of the wind turbine generators. So understanding the impact on our oceanography is very critical in terms of water column disturbance or change and effects. Again, effects versus impacts, and this is an effect that may happen. What will the impacts of that effect be on fisheries or marine mammals? Converting habitat, so we're going to be going in vast areas of sandy flat bottom, some cobble gravel where they're actually able to, in at depths where they're able to achieve what their engineering criteria are. But we're going to be converting that habitat to structure, right, which can be a good thing for some animals, but it will change the ecosystem in terms of providing large areas in refugia areas for structure-loving animals. So habitat conversion is something that we care about. The noise and vessel traffic associated with the turbine operations and the amount of vessels that will be needed to maintain the facility over its life history is also something that we're going to care about. Electromagnetic fields, EMF, due to submarine cable burial, that'll be a part of the impact or effect of the project that will extend from federal waters to state waters where the cables are buried to attach to land. The lighting of the wind farms themselves will have an effect on the project, And then, of course, vessel safety and whether vessels are going to be able to access these areas either to fish or access these areas to survey, depending on the size of the vessel and the sea state. So that's during the operational phase. Next slide, please. And then during construction, operation, and decommissioning, submarine cabling, both inside and outside of the lease areas, understanding the electromagnetic fields, and then as we've seen sort of in the Gulf of Mexico with sort of idle iron policies, if we've created a certain type of habitat and it has an effect and maybe it's a positive impact on a fishery, 20 years from now when we're going to decommission it, it's something that we'll have to tackle. Do you want to be removing it? Right now, the way these projects are going in, they will be removed. But that will be an effect during the type of construction activities required to remove the structures from the water column and just above the substrate surface. Next slide, please. So during some other types of fisheries interactions, there will likely be and there will be exclusion of fishing activity within wind farms. There might be new fisheries that can develop within the constraints of 0.8 mile or 1 mile spacing of these wind turbines in areas of 84 to more than that turbines at a particular location. But during construction and after construction, we're going to change the way our fleets currently behave in these areas. We'll be creating new habitat, both at the species and possible ecosystem level effects. And then we'll be also looking at the biological effects of the noise in EMF fields. Next slide. In terms of protected species and marine mammal interactions, this is a sort of a boil down document that was developed a couple years ago with New England Aquarium and the Mass Clean Energy Council to look at developing a science framework for protected species. But there are a number of effects on our marine mammals that we are very concerned about, either excluding them during the construction of the noise or even attracting animals to sites because we're changing the ecosystem. Changing behaviors, feeding, socializing, nursing, potential stress due to noise impacts, and then large-scale ecosystem change. As we change the oceanography of these areas, are we changing critical drivers of the environment that are producing callinus, for instance, that are important in North Atlantic right whales? And what types of impacts at a site level or even at a regional level will that have on protected species that we're charged to manage? Next slide. The other very challenging piece of these interactions is how the cumulative impacts. As we develop these projects between now and 2027, we're going to have multiple projects constructed simultaneously over the next 7+ years, and then operations over the next 27+ years. And what will be the cumulative ecosystem effects of these projects on the resource? And how do we even go about evaluating that? Next slide. So what are some of the hypotheses that we need to address? Is what are the effects of construction, operation, deconstruction on fisheries, protected species, aquaculture, habitats, or ecosystems, including human communities? Can these effects be mitigated? How will components of the system adapt? Next slide. In terms of interactions between offshore wind energy and our science enterprise and our operations, this is something that is hitting the Science Center fairly hard in terms of maybe not fully appreciating that there was going to be this scale of development over this amount of time and how that would interact with our surveys. But we are now, over the last number of years, coming to realize, based on we have one project, Vineyard Wind Project is the first one out of the gate right now. But as we get to understand what the engineering and the construction requirements are, now we can put two and two together, and what it looks like is our large survey vessels and the way that we conduct our aerial surveys are going to face major disruptions in the way they're currently deployed. So we're going to not only impact and affect the way that our fleets behave in displacing fishing effort, but we're likely going to have to change the way that we survey, particularly with our large vessels, whether it's the Henry Bigelow or the Twin Otter, which is used for our aerial surveys for large marine mammals, and specifically for North Atlantic right whale aerial survey. We're going to have to employ either different types of survey gear and also change the types of surveys that we conduct. So next slide, please. We are just, like I said before, just beginning to sort of tackle this issue. So we've got potential interactions of these sites with every core survey that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center deploys as part of our scientific enterprise. Our integrated benthic Atlantic sea scallop survey, our clam dredge survey, our ocean quahog dredge survey, our multi-species bottom trawl survey, our large-scale shelf break ecosystem monitoring survey that surveys the entire shelf and is a key data point that feeds into national climate assessments and understanding large-scale ecosystem changes. And a lot of these surveys, particularly our EcoMon and multi-species bottom trawl survey, have been occurring for decades. And many of these surveys, particularly our fisheries surveys, are random stratified designs. Some of our ship and aircraft protected species surveys are line transects. Relative to the random stratified designs, each of those surveys, like the multi-species bottom trawl survey, have strata that are placed along the shelf and across the shelf. And just some preliminary analyses, these survey strata are impacted either from 0% to as much as 97% of the strata would now be occupied within a wind energy area. Now, these projects are not going to be developed like overnight. It is happening quickly, but we have right now what's in the pipeline is a 20-year pipeline of projects, so we have a little bit of time to think about this. Not a lot. The North Atlantic right whale aerial survey block, 60% of that survey is within wind energy area developments. So we're going to have to start thinking about, in a number of ways, how are we going to support our management process that is underpinned by this science. And as you all know and struggle without new emerging uses, having the most accurate, the best available, and precise data is really critical in making decisions. And when we introduce a lack of accuracy or reduced precision in the science, it has impacts on the management decisions we make. So how can we go into this with our eyes wide open so that we can coexist, offshore wind energy and fisheries, and plan it and invest in the type of science investments that we absolutely are going to need to address the fact that we're going to have to change the way we're currently conducting our scientific enterprise. Next slide, please. So some of the survey issues, our large ships that are particularly ones that are deploying gear are not going to be sampling within wind energy turbines. So these areas we're going to need to figure out what's happening in those areas. We're going to be sampling outside those areas. So with things, some of the concepts of calibrating as we move to a different survey technique, considering that we're going to need to calibrate new survey designs, that takes a lot of time. It takes experimental design, it takes working with partners, working with collaborators, thinking through the science and the statistics, changing detectability. So if we're flying right now, our North Atlantic right whale aerial survey is flown between 750 or 1,000 feet above sea level, above the sea state. The Twin Otter needs to maintain a 500-foot buffer between the aircraft and any obstacle. So if we're now flying, and the maximal radial height of current technology turbines is about 866 feet. So we're going to be now flying at 1,500 feet once these turbines go in. And again, this is an area that is known North Atlantic right whale wintering grounds. So we're going to have to change that survey. Well, how is that going to change the detectability of those animals or smaller animals that are sampled using similar survey techniques? So we can predict and what these effects are going to be, what the impacts on them. We just need to now roll up our sleeves and design solutions to address these survey impacts. I will say that John here and our leadership recently began to announce the formation of an internal center working group to do a first order evaluation of our science. We're going to start with the multi-species bottom trawl survey, and this is really to just get the bounds of the problem on our surveys. And we will be, this is not something, these surveys have been in place for decades. It's not something we're going to change overnight. It's going to be deliberative. It's going to involve working with all of you. It's going to involve working with collaborators and our councils, commission, and others. So there's, look forward to a lot more on that. But that is definitely something that the Science Center is taking very seriously. Next slide, please. So some key challenges, which I've already gotten into, is we're doing this, and Mike has a slide on our offshore wind team, so I'm not going to cover it, but committing staff without dedicated funding. We have some temporary funds, and so we have a few projects that are happening, and I presented on those. The regulatory review for one project is enormous. Dozens of people across the NOAA Fisheries region and headquarters are involved in these, and they have other jobs. So this is a major workload constraint for NOAA Fisheries. We receive requests almost weekly for fisheries data, whether it's socioeconomic fisheries data or the regional office requests for dealer data or VTR data requests, VMS data requests, study fleet data requests, and we're just not set up to address this space, and we're often in the position of saying no, we can't stop doing this council action or commission action to dedicate a new research initiative. But we're doing the best we can in providing that information and serving that information out as fast and as quickly as we possibly can. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges of this is the pace and scale of development, effectively engaging our NOAA Fisheries stakeholders in the process, which has been challenging over the last number of years due to the nature of state procurements and state-driven processes and the nature of the environment, which is a very large regional fisheries environment where fishermen fish from one state are fishing in the waters of another state, and they're not showing up at the state working group meeting that's 500 miles from their port, but they're fishing within the wind energy area that group is making decisions on. So those are some challenges in addressing some of the science questions that I went over. Next slide. Some other challenges: how will floating technology change the map of wind development? This map does not show the Gulf of Maine. I predict, in the next few years, this map will be, I would imagine, might be expanded. I know that we'll be considering more technology in that region. What is knowledgeable from what we learned from pile developments to floating developments? Next slide, please. In terms of opportunities and bright spots, we do have an excellent instrument or tool to build the type of trust and collaboration necessary to address many of these issues. So we have, with the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, NOAA, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a commitment to work with each other to bring fisheries considerations into the process early and often, and to address the science needs. Next slide for other opportunities. So without a framework or scientific research and monitoring framework in place now, which is basically where we are right now, we have individual developers and states investing in research and monitoring at either an individual site level or a topic level. Without a regional plan or framework that links all these efforts together in a coherent way, we'll be looking at the environment on the left. Topic 1, Development 1, Topic 2, Topic 3. In 10 years from now, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center will be within a stock assessment working group meeting, and we'll be asked, well, what about this wind development? How is that affecting this aspect of this population? And we'll be challenged to be able to answer those types of questions, because if we're using different standards, different methodologies, different peer review processes, if we're duplicating effort in terms of research or monitoring, we're not going to have the ability to answer all the questions that I posed earlier. Having a coherent regional framework where everything is rolled up together, where there's communication and we're sharing ideas about how to survey differently, how to calibrate surveys with each other in order to go back to historic time series, to bridge with new time series. A lot of that is going to require stitching all this together. And so the one opportunity that has emerged is the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. I know there was a meeting last week. I know Annie will be talking a little bit about Rhoda and Rosa later today. But we need something like this so that we're not doing this ad hoc, one-off projects in terms of understanding the interactions and impacts. Next slide, please. The other opportunity is we do have 20 years of European experience. A recent publication, meta-analysis of finfish abundance on offshore wind farms, was a sort of a meta-analysis of every published study that looked at fisheries impacts on offshore wind. However, despite 20 years of experience, that publication could only find 13 peer-reviewed publications. So there's not a lot to draw from. So we're starting, in many ways, we're starting from scratch to some degree in terms of developing the peer review literature. 13 publications on finfish and wind farms is not a lot. Science Center, if on a good year, will publish 100 peer-reviewed articles in any one year. So it's roughly 10 per month, and we've got 13 publications over 20 years. But we do have 20 years to draw from Europe in terms of their development activities. Next slide. So other opportunities is Science Center working to better understand the impacts on our surveys. We're going to continue to support the development of a regional science framework, whether it's ROSA, we hope it's ROSA, or something else. We need to do it. We're going to strengthen our support and work collaboratively with Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, RODA, BOEM, and all of you. We're going to continue the wind energy-related research that we have ongoing as funds allow. And just to conclude, again, this new space use is here. It's the rest of our careers challenge for us. We need to achieve coexistence. We want fisheries and fishing communities to occupy the same space and same importance as offshore wind energy in terms of a coexistence paradigm. Protected species are a premier concern in our region. We have some very, very challenging situations with protected species, notably North Atlantic right whales, and it's going to take some creativity for us to address the science challenges, the management challenges of those resources. Habitats and ecosystems are going to change, and offshore wind energy may provide us with opportunities, new opportunities in terms of detection in science and research, but in terms of new different platforms that we could utilize, and then potentially new types of survey efforts that we're going to need to deploy will create opportunities for further collaboration. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Great presentation. That was very, very informative. What we're going to do, instead of taking questions now, we're going to let Mike Pentney do his so we get the federal perspective, and then I think we'll open the questions and discussion. So, Mike, it's all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Just request your patience. I know there may be some really good questions out there for Andy on his presentation. What I want to do is take this opportunity to just go into a little bit more detail on process, roles, and responsibilities, so that if there are any questions, you know, they're within the context of understanding kind of who's doing what and when within this overall issue that Andy just did a really good job of describing and providing context for. So this is in everybody's presentation, I'm sure, so you'll see it 15 times today. So I'll just skip over it, but keep this in mind. This is the context, obviously, for why we're here today. So just who does what? Who's responsible for what in terms of? Oh, sorry. Can you go ahead? Remember to cue Tony on that. Yep. So just to restate, BOEM, Bureau of Offshore Energy or Ocean Energy Management. Sorry, I forget what the acronym stands for. But within the Department of Interior is the lead federal agency and primary decision maker. Can't stress that enough. National Marine Fisheries Service provides advice to BOEM and comments and input. And obviously BOEM is working very closely with us on all of their projects, and we appreciate, particularly at the staff-to-staff level, we have established over the last couple of years some really, really strong, good working relationships with BOEM staff and our staff, and that has really benefited the process. In terms of what information, what advice and comments we provide to BOEM on these projects, we're kind of somewhat limited or constrained, if you will, by the statutory mandates provided by Congress. And what I mean by that is, we provide advice and comments under the auspices of our review of BOEM's NEPA document, their environmental impact statement that they prepare as the action agency, and that we have the opportunity, as does the public, to review those documents and provide our comments. Under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, obviously we can provide advice and comments. Primarily under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, our authority rests on essential fish habitat issues. There is a consultation requirement in the Magnuson Act for federal agencies that are engaging in activities that have the potential to have an adverse impact on essential fish habitat. Those agencies are required to consult with NIMS on those potential actions, and we have the opportunity to provide some conservation recommendations to those agencies. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, or MMPA, we are the authority, or the agency with authority to issue an incidental take permit or incidental take authorization for marine mammal potential takes. And there's a process and a permit process that we go through with the action agency before we authorize an incidental take of a marine mammal. Under the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, we do what's called a formal consultation with the action agency that results in a biological opinion to determine whether the action as proposed would jeopardize the continued existence of any species listed under the Endangered Species Act, so endangered species or threatened species, or critical habitat for those species. And if we determine that jeopardy would exist, then we impose, or we include in our biological opinion, reasonable and prudent alternatives. Alternatives to the action. In other words, the action can go forward, but there are things that can be done to mitigate some of those impacts. And you all around the table are familiar with all of these. We do the same work, the same reviews for council actions on fishery management issues. We do biological opinions. As you know, we're working on one right now as a result of right whales that affects all of our council fishery management plans. We work with the states quite often on Section 10 permits, consultations for that, and we certainly review to the same standard the NEPA documents prepared by our councils for fishery management actions. So BOEM, being the action agency, is required to consider our advice and comments. Now, depending on whether we're talking about input under the Endangered Species Act or Marine Mammal Protection Act, there are slightly higher standards for their consideration of our advice. But the message I'm trying to get across is that we work with BOEM collaboratively We provide input, we review their documents, and we provide advice to them on how those documents can be improved. So our administration issued Executive Order 13807 to streamline environmental reviews and improve collaboration among agencies during the review process for major infrastructure projects. And this offshore wind energy obviously falls into that category of a major infrastructure project. That executive order establishes a 2-year goal for completing all of the environmental reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. So a 2-year requirement for completing the environmental impact statement. Those of you familiar with council processes know that 2 years is a pretty aggressive timeline to develop and complete an environmental impact statement. But that's the goal within the executive order, and we work with BOEM on that. The one federal decision process adds a slightly different wrinkle to it, which is that it requires federal agencies that have a role in the action to rely on the same document. Now, going back to the previous slide where I mentioned an incidental take authorization to be issued under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, absent this one federal decision process, BOEM might have developed their EIS for the wind energy project itself, and then NIMS could have developed its own environmental impact statement, its own NEPA document, before it issued any incidental take permit. There would have been potentially 2 separate NEPA documents that would have been relied on for those actions. Under the one federal decision policy, we would adopt the BOEM's EIS for the purposes of issuing or making a determination to issue the incidental take authorization under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So we do use BOEM's EIS for that purpose. An additional aspect of the one federal decision process is that there's a term of art under NEPA called a cooperating agency that engages the agencies in different concurrence points along the way as an action agency develops a document. And the one federal decision process establishes that if we're invited to participate as a cooperating agency, then we must do so, unless we can provide a really strong reason why it's not necessary. So we are obviously a cooperating agency with BOEM on the NEPA document for these projects. And there are 3 different concurrence points that we provide written concurrence to BOEM throughout that process. The first is when BOEM has prepared the purpose and need for the action under NEPA. We review that purpose and need, provide our concurrence on the purpose and need, that it's clearly stated that we believe it complies with the requirements of NEPA. There's also a concurrence point when the range of alternatives is prepared. It's provided to the cooperating agencies, and we provide our concurrence, or have a concurrence review that the range of alternatives is sufficient and meets the requirements of NEPA. And then the last concurrence point is when the action agency identifies its preferred alternative before completing its EIS. And again, that would be an opportunity for us as a cooperating agency to review the proposed preferred alternative and, if warranted, provide our concurrence that the preferred alternative appears justified and that there's a strong rationale for the selection of that preferred alternative. And again, the concurrence under the one federal decision, you can see the quote there, is really, there is sufficient information to move to the next step. So it's really a procedural review and a completeness review under NEPA. When we're asked to provide our concurrence, we have 10 business days to provide our written concurrence. If there is a non-concurrence at that point, there is an internal elevation process that's available to the action agency that would elevate the review up through the Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Commerce level. I mentioned this earlier, but so under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the incidental take authorization, the project proponent applies for this incidental harassment authorization or letter of authorization. We will issue that if the take will be of small numbers, have no more than a negligible impact on the species, and not have an adverse impact that can't be mitigated in some way. Under the Endangered Species Act, the Section 7 consultation is at the request of the action agency. All federal actions are considered under the biological opinion. So this kind of gets into cumulative effects. We look at all actions that have the potential to affect the listed species. And then we determine whether the project is likely to jeopardize the listed species or adversely modify the critical habitat, as I mentioned. I mentioned the essential fish habitat consultation. All offshore wind consultations are likely expanded EFH consultations. We look to assess the potential adverse impacts to essential fish habitat, and we provide conservation recommendations to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts to essential fish habitat. And then under the more broad context or framework of fishery resources and fishing industry or community impacts, we don't have a statutory specific threshold like an EFH consultation or an ESA jeopardy review or the Marine Mammal Protection Act standard that I gave you. But we do, under the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA review, evaluate the impacts as they're described in the document and the cumulative effects on marine trust resources that includes both the fishery resources and the fishing community and fishing industry to evaluate whether those potential impacts have been fully identified, described, and evaluated. So the standard of review, that's why there's question marks there. It's not as clear-cut in terms of some of the other statutes that we operate under, but we do work very frequently with NEPA, and we obviously have standards of review that we apply to counsel fishery management actions, and so we work to apply those same standards of review in our review of other agencies' NEPA documents as well. This is the timeline under the one federal decision process. As I mentioned, it's fairly aggressive for those of you that have been involved in the development of EISs over time. It may be a little bit hard to see on this slide, but the bottom blue is the notice of intent, which is published in the Federal Register as an agency is about to embark on the development of an EIS, to the record of decision, which is the final signature to adopt an environmental impact statement, is 2 years under the one federal decision timeline. You can see the light blue up top is, roughly 1 year, 2 months. Is for the notice of intent to develop the draft EIS. Then there's a public review process of that draft, and then the preparation of the final EIS. That's about 8 months, and then generally 2 months from the time of developing the final EIS to signing the record of decision. In addition to, or maybe layered on top of is a better way to think of it, the one federal decision executive order that applies to all federal agencies, the Department of Interior issued its own order directing itself to limit environmental impact statements to between 150 and 300 pages, and to further compress the timeline to an even more aggressive time frame. And so down below you can see the timeline that BOEM has been working under thus far with the Vineyard Wind Project as an example shows that it's much more compressed and aggressive than even the aggressive one federal decision process would provide for. 8 months up top from the notice of intent to develop the draft EIS, 7 months to go from publishing a draft EIS to preparation of the final EIS, and then the 2 months for the record of decision are compressed within that so that the whole process takes around a year and a half or so. So Andy mentioned there's the Northeast Region Offshore Wind Team. It ensures that we have collaboration among the various parties within both the Science Center and the regional office and NIMS headquarters that have an interest in and need to participate. So we have staff from all of our relevant project offices, the Protected Resources Division, Habitat Division, Fisheries Division, both here at the regional office, at headquarters, and at the Science Center. We have engaged with both councils to include a staff member on the wind team so that the councils are fully engaged and aware of what's going on. We coordinate with staff from the commission so that there's an awareness and participation at will on that. The wind team does have a charter so that it's clearly understood what their roles and responsibility and scope of effort is. They have monthly calls and meetings as needed. When you see if you see a letter from us, we provided public comments to BOEM on their Vineyard Wind Draft EIS. 44 pages of comments. That comment letter wasn't penned directly by me sitting in my office late at night. Obviously, I have a lot of support. The wind team are the people that went through the document line by line, page by page, prepared those comments for me. So the wind team is the group responsible for those reviews. They are the group that's working side by side with BOEM staff throughout the process. But as Andy mentioned, nobody on our wind team is a full-time person assigned to work on wind. Everybody on the wind team is working. Their full-time job is something else. Doug Crystal is sitting over there. A lot of people know Doug. He is a critical person on the wind team representing the Sustainable Fisheries Division at the regional office. But when he's working on wind projects, he's not working on his primary task, which is to help the Mid-Atlantic Council manage the squid, mackerel, and butterfish fishery. So there is a cost and a prioritization that's occurring as our staff at the regional office and science center are working on wind issues. They're not working on other issues that are really important to this group and to our council partners, as well as other federal agencies. We have staff from Protected Resources and Habitat divisions that when they're working on the consultations and wind issues, they're not working on other projects, supporting the Corps of Engineers or other federal agencies in their projects. So I'm not saying that as a way. I'm not complaining. I'm just making it clear that we are resource limited, as all of the states around the table are. I don't believe any of you have people solely dedicated to work on wind energy issues. That you are diverting resources from other important issues to work on wind energy issues, and we recognize that. We're in the same boat. Again, just why are we, having a conversation that involves all of the states? It's not just because of the map that I showed earlier that shows that wind projects are potentially going to exist up and down our coast from Massachusetts or even off Maine down to Georgia. But even a project that is not directly off a state's coast may have an impact on that state's fisheries. So this is just a very rough pie chart that shows for Vineyard Wind, looking at a 3-year time frame, 2015 to 2017, you can see that most of the fishing revenue comes from Rhode Island, which is probably not a big surprise, with Massachusetts also being important. But you can see New York there in the light blue, New Jersey there is purple, Connecticut is red, and then other states is in the darker blue. So, a considerable amount of the impacts to fishing, potential impacts to fishing revenue, just from Vineyard Wind, one project, has the potential to affect fisheries and fishing communities from many more states. So that's why I think, we are encouraged to have this meeting today, engage directly with all of you to make sure that you're aware and engaged in communicating with us on projects that may not be directly off your coast, but may have the indirect effect on your state's fisheries. So these are some prompt questions that I hope by the end of today we are able to have a little bit better answer to. But which agency should we work with at each state? How do the states, coastal zone management, energy and environment, or fisheries agencies work together? How are they structured? Who are the best points of contact for us and for each other as we coordinate on this? To what level should the states coordinate amongst themselves, or should everything be going through NIMS? Each state, as I mentioned, operates slightly differently. We need to understand those differences in order to operate more effectively. When is it appropriate to have staff-to-staff conversations, or when do we need to engage with at the leadership levels? And then what types of regional forums would be useful as a tool to improve coordination. We throw up the Rosa group as an example, but there are other fora that might be helpful. So I think, Mr. Chairman, with that, I will pause, and we can see if there's questions either for Andy and his presentation or for me in my presentation.
Thanks, Mike. That was outstanding. It really captured the whole issue. And I'll echo what Mike had said at the South Carolina NRCC meeting. We were talking about our wind teams, and Mike just sort of characterized his wind team had full-time jobs, and suddenly this thing came over the transom very quickly. My wind team has 2 people, and they both had full-time jobs. So I think most of the states are going to be struggling with this. This came upon us very quickly, and some of the time frames are faster than anything we've done, at least in my career. So it's going to be a big challenge, and hopefully part of what we get through today is get ready for it, because it's coming. So let's open it up for questions right now to either Pat or Mike, and see what we get to. So, Tony DeLarnia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Andy. I have a couple of questions that follow your slides as you presented them. One of your first slides said exclusion of some activity during construction. Is that exclusion of some fishing activity? Now, that exclusion that you were referring to, was it only during the construction phase, or is there a consideration of some permanent exclusion?
So I'm definitely not the person to answer in terms of the regulatory restrictions. My understanding, and I know there's excellent representatives from BOEM that can answer this, but when I was referring to exclusion, I mean when you place these structures in the water and you have some fishery operations. If you're pair trawling, you're not going to pair trawl in a wind farm, right? Even if you had many thousands of meters of spacing, there's going to be exclusions just by the nature of putting structures in areas that we currently fish. But your question of during the construction, during the construction activity, again, if you're operating a vessel, you're probably not going to be fishing right up against, where you have jack-up barges. I mean, it's just not going to happen. But in terms of Coast Guard, and my understanding from the Coast Guard, and I know Michelle Moran, you're here, and you can probably answer this, is there's not going to be any formal regulatory exclusions or closures. Is that correct? She's raising her yes. Yeah, so this is going to be, when I say exclusion, it's going to be by practice or by, and that'll always be vessel operator, even if there is a policy that NOAA puts on its ships, we're always going to have our captain's call, like, do I feel safe going in here during a 10-foot sea state and I'm deploying mobile gear? It's not going to happen. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you. I have a couple of other follow-up questions, if I may, Mr. Chairman. One of them was you made it very clear that you can't see the Bigelow getting into these areas once the farms are constructed. Now, my assumption is you're making that comment based upon the placement or the distance between the towers themselves. Is that the reason for making the comment regarding the Bigelow?
So maybe I wasn't clear. Probably I wasn't. Impacts on our surveys. If we have a wind farm turbine array, it's very difficult to impose a stratified random sampling scheme in there if you can only sample in the center line between turbines. That's not our current survey schema doesn't work. So that's from a sort of a survey methodology standpoint. Second is operations. Yes, our current Office of Marine and Aviation Administration policy is when we're operating in the Gulf of Mexico or even around Block Island, we maintain a 1.2 mile or 1 nautical mile distance from structures when we're surveying. So that's our current sort of standard practice. The captain can always make a more conservative call and will and largely likely and usually do make those calls of staying away from structures. Did that answer your question?
Yes, you did, but if I can build on your answer, have you considered substituting industry vessels, small vessels that perhaps be more maneuverable, more adept at operating in tighter quarters? Have you considered substituting industry vessels for some of the work that the Bigelow is doing?
So this is a big topic, and we're not taking it lightly. We're not going to change our operations overnight. There's a number of different alternatives, survey platforms, survey technologies, statistical survey designs. So it's like, how can we sample the animals or the environment, the types of gear, vessels, platforms, and then it's the type of survey design that we want to employ to understand what's happening in the population to serve as our basis for our scientific advice. So those are two different things. We're beginning this process right now with our internal working group to just get a better handle on the scope of the impacts for each of our, it's like roughly 6 or 7 core surveys. We're starting with the bottom trawl survey. We'll be looking at everything. Is there a future where we may need to utilize smaller vessels to sample in wind farms, and using industry vessels could be part of that solution? Is there a potentiality of looking at the NEMAP surveys and doing something with, we need to set the table. When we have not made any decisions, and frankly, I know I'll speak for John here, we don't feel like we're ready to make any decision yet. We need to design a process, an inclusive process to actually to make those decisions. 'Cause as you know, when you move from one survey to another, you're going to decrease precision as you're building your time series. So we need to do this very methodically.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, one final question for Mr. Pentney. You had mentioned that I saw in your slide, BOEM is not required. Well, it says BOEM is required to consider your advice, but evidently your advice is not holding or binding on BOEM. Is that correct?
Outside of specific statutory authorization under the Endangered Species Act, should we issue a jeopardy opinion, which would have reasonable and prudent alternatives, or conditions that we require to be placed on any incidental take authorization under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, all of our comments are advisory.
Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think everybody's aware that Virginia is currently going through construction right now to 6 megawatt, sort of a pilot project from the entity that won the federal auction back in, I think, 2013-14 timeframe. And so we're already having to deal with some of the facets of this right now. And I didn't know, Andy, if you had considered potentially to mitigate the issues regarding the survey, permanent equipment at some of these stations, these platforms. We only control the 3 mile out, I guess, which is primarily just channeling for the cable. But when you get out there, this project's going to be 27 nautical miles out offshore. Have you thought about that? That's one question. And also, this is a pilot project in which it's anticipated that up to potentially 2,000 megawatts of wind power is going to be developed over time. Have we thought about overbuilding the channeling right now so we're not dealing with disturbances over and over again to build out a project like that? Just a couple of questions. Thank you.
I could take the first one. How about the second one? I would say we're beginning to, we have a advanced technology survey working group, sort of a national group probably the name wrong. And so we're looking at ways to improve our science, improve our accuracy and precision, utilizing advanced survey techniques, whether it's acoustics or video or optical, is something that our agency is very interested in. These platforms may be an excellent opportunity to fix new technologies, ocean science and technologies. So that's an opportunity, but we have to understand the scope of the problem first what are practical ways for us to begin transitioning for surveys that we know we're going to have to transition. How do we transition them? What type of survey technologies could we use? How do we calibrate so we don't lose those time series and then lose precision as we build new ones? So we're thinking about that, but we have, again, as Mike put, and I'll just be blunt since I hope I'm not being quoted on this, but we have no dedicated resources for this. None. Okay, so thinking about it is right now is like at nighttime when we get home, we're like, yeah, it'd be really cool to do this, but we don't have a dedicated program in place right now to transition our surveys. Right now we have an internal working group to bound the problem and think about how do we go forward with addressing it holistically. And I think we have to address it holistically and do it deliberatively. I would say that we do receive that question a lot, and it does feel like, well, we can just put some stuff on the wind farms and that'll solve the problem. I think there's a lack of appreciation of what it takes to design a new survey, to change your science enterprise, and the ability to use that science to make decisions, and for it to stand up. Those decisions stand up in a peer review collaborative process. Those are high bars. And so we are thinking about it. We need to think a lot more about it. The other question you had is about overbuilding these, and that would not be a question for NIMS to answer. I wouldn't even know where to go with that. The only thing I will say is the technology for offshore wind is changing very fast. So while Vineyard Wind, I think, is using a 12 megawatt nacelle, I'm probably saying the wrong terms, so folks can correct me. What I understand, even 5 years from now, it'll be a different type of technology in place. It'll be a larger turbine. And so it seems like the industry is going to larger turbines, so higher turbines. But I couldn't really comment on, building out an area larger or not. I don't know if Mike, I don't think Mike has anything to say about that either.
Thanks, Brian. The only thing I like about this was nacelle. It sounded like Star Trek, so other than that, I don't know anything about it either. Go ahead, Stu.
Thank you. Mike, you mentioned under the one federal decision policy that an agency has 10 days to concur, and you probably said this, and I missed it, but if an agency either fails to concur or does nothing, fails to act in that regard, what is that taken as concurrence and everything moves forward?
So, yes, we have 10 days to respond with our written concurrence. If your question is, how is a lack of response interpreted? Is that interpreted as concurrence? I don't know off the top of my head, but we will do everything we can to avoid a lack of response. We want to be clear in our response. If we provide a non-concurrence, a written non-concurrence, that then the action agency has the opportunity to trigger the elevation process that would go up through the Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Commerce for resolution.
John?
Thanks. Just kind of as a baseline question, following up on the resource issue, who's paying for what right now? I mean, it's common practice on the land-based real estate development that the developer comes up and pays for the environmental reviews, and that is part of the package. So kind of just as a baseline information, who's paying for what now?
In terms of our review, we're paying, our staff time and resources for them to participate and conduct these reviews, the same as we do for all federal actions, whether we're reviewing a Corps of Engineers request for a dredging permit or some other agency's action.
I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation that we had some previous and ongoing work collaboratively with BOEM, and BOEM in Department of Defense we have very large reimbursable agreements for like our AMAPS program for some of the environmental studies work that we're doing, through the Black Sea bass and squid sound behaviors stuff. But in terms of the technical review, that's all, that's you, taxpayers. I would say that some of the efforts to establish a regional science framework, ROSA, which it does exist as an entity, looks to have the support of offshore wind developers themselves contributing to that. I don't know if any checks have been written yet, but I know there are conversations about that.
Yeah, I guess that was the point I was going to make, is that, maybe there's a way to have the developers pay for part of these much-needed resources that both your entities have. I know the lease payments go directly into the federal treasury, not back into BOEM or not. But so I know, just oftentimes the review is paid by the people that are trying to build the thing. So I know it's probably above all of our pay grades, but I wanted to put it up.
Just thrown from the state perspective, it's pretty much the same thing right now, John, is that the state agencies, or at least in my agency, we're footing the bill on this right now, but there's a recognition that because of the magnitude of this, is that it's going to require a significant amount of effort, and I think where we're going next is that where is the revenue going to come for this, for really, and again, I think the federal agencies have gotten, so as we, is like we're, I guess we got someone portrayed as maybe a roadblock. I said, no, we're actually here to kind of make sure, identify all the issues up front so that there aren't brick walls you're going to run into at some point. But again, a lot of us have the guns to do this right now. So.
And it makes it even worse with the compressed timelines that you're following. So that's all.
The one thing I would just add, John, and you'll probably get these updates from the states, there are individual states that are pursuing wind development who do have funds, and they are putting some of those funds into research and monitoring activities. Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New York right now, the three that I'm aware of.
Other questions? Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Andy. So I was at the NRCC meeting, and I understand, thank you for your presentation. I have a good understanding of, you've identified a problem. It sounds now like you've got a group that you've put together. What I'm trying to figure out is what progress has been made. I'm trying to think of a good way to kind of phrase this. So I recognize that you all recognize there's an issue. I'm talking specifically about the survey and the science enterprise. So there's a recognition of the problem. Sounds like you've maybe put a group together. You talked a little bit about that at the NRCC meeting. You've said more today, but what's not clear to me is, so is there an actual effort, specific effort, research, whatever, going on right now, or are you still trying to sort out how you're going to pay for that? You kind of know the team that you need, you are getting a sense of the resources that you're going to need, but is anything happening yet, or it's still in the kind of team development phase?
Scoping. I would say this is all bounding the problem, utilizing what resources we have available to think about it, and to think about it, we had a full day at the New England Council meeting. For someone that isn't engrossed in the wind issue, it takes a lot of time to get up to speed of what this is and what the constraints are relative to our science. But we are scoping what the problem is, what possible pathways or solutions, like what would it take to address, the bottom trawl survey and then the rest of our surveys as well. But I would say I would really call it, we're at scoping, and I don't think we can do anything more without any, and I'm not advocating for resources right now. I'm not allowed to do that, but we currently don't have dedicated funding. We have prioritization and planning processes within the Science Center, so we could, if depending on our funding level, we could internally decide not to do these 5 assessments. Mike Simpkins is back there, he'll probably kill me. We could decide not to do these assessments this year because we're going to focus on wind. We haven't had those conversations yet. But in the absence of no additional funds, we're going to be forced into those conversations internally.
Dan McKiernan.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that there was $400 million generated in lease fees, and I wonder if maybe not the federal government because of your unique situation, but maybe ASMFC could talk to Congress about maybe dedicating some of that monies to getting some of this accomplished. And obviously this follows up on John's point. Who's paying, and the fact that there is funds that's been already generated.
Okay, Bob, you got that? Going to go up to Capitol Hill and get. Okay, all right. Yeah, we'll put that on. No, it's not. It's a good suggestion, but yeah. So, Eric.
Yeah, I just have a comment, if that's okay. Or do you want questions on?
No, comments are fine too. Go ahead.
So
Eric.
there was a question about what is going to be excluded in these areas. That's the first thing. Fishing activity will most likely be excluded on a grand scale, especially the trawl fleet. You got to remember that these things are all connected on the seabed. So there has to be a cable from each one of those towers to a substation, and then the substation has the extension cord that's going to have to come ashore somewhere. That's a concern ASMFC should have, because that is coastal. That's going to impact a lot of things. But we're anticipating that the fishing industry will be excluded on in my mind, a grand scale. The other thing that's going to be excluded is if you're in that wind farm and you have a problem and you're in the water in your survival suit, we don't know if the Coast Guard helicopter is going to be able to get in there and look for you. I mean, there is a substantial amount of safety concerns, and whether or not safety at sea is going to be excluded from those wind farms, that's a question, and that's a big question. And as far as who pays, I mean, I'm paying. I'm paying with my own personal time because I have a job, and there is a lot of companies like mine that we're doing the same thing you all are doing. I work on wind as much as I can possibly squeeze into my normal day. And there are dozens of companies that have to follow this because we do get the opportunity to comment. Whether the comments are listened to, that's another story. But, we have to be educated as well. So it's not just the feds or the councils. Industry is paying now because we have to be on top of this. And the problem is, stuff changes so fast. I mean, you talk about the nacelles, the size of those things. I mean, there's a picture, somebody's got a picture of it in the audience. I mean, the new ones look like, I don't know, maybe a 5-story building. To the point where the equipment that's going to install that nacelle doesn't even exist because they're too big. So that's the technology that's evolving. And then the blade on that thing, one blade is about 310 feet long. So, look at the Washington Monument. How high is that? And add a couple of 3 blades on top of it, 300 feet long. That's what you're looking at. I mean, these are scary. It's pretty scary. But, we're concerned about the science, but it's, we have to stay on top of it whether we like it or not. And it's Rosa and Rhoda have been a great ally for industry, and hopefully that'll go forward. But You know, it's in New England. It's happening. It's happening fast, and it's pretty scary. So I appreciate you guys spending the time with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to some of those points, I know it's been an eye-opener, the port infrastructure, some of the ports can't handle, the bridges are too low to even transport this stuff. There's a whole lot of things that are sort of mushrooming. I mean, we were back 5, maybe 10 years ago, and the first things that were coming out were very small, and they seem to be, every year, they're just going up dramatically in size. And to the payment part, and this is a question I was at one meeting, it's like, well, eventually the ratepayer is going to pay. We're all going to be paying for this. And for all you who are maybe Tony's age, that who remembers nuclear power when it was going to be so cheap, it was like they couldn't even meter it, they'd give it away, and, you know, we see how that goes. So, you know, what's the ultimate cost of this all going to be? So, Bill.
Just to comment on funding support from the state perspective. The RAW Act that was introduced in this Congress, now has, I think, 116 co-sponsors, has as its source of funding money coming through the U.S. Treasury Fund, but as I understand it, it's aimed to originate from offshore leases. And this money is prioritized towards work that is needed to assess impacts and recovery for federally endangered and state endangered species. So it certainly, if marine entities within the various state agencies are positioned to take advantage of this flow of funds, if and when it does happen, that is there's a nice nexus there to justify support for some of the work that might need to be done going forward.
Yeah, good point, Bill. Other questions or comments? Meredith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you, Andy and Mike, for your presentations. I think you've done a really nice job of framing this conversation. I think in a lot of ways we hear concerns raised regarding the interactions of fisheries and wind power as obstruction, as lack of interest in pursuing renewables, of just concerns about anything interacting or preventing fishing activity. And I think you've really reframed this conversation to be about a much broader set of impacts that address the public trust responsibilities that we're all here to represent. And I really appreciate that. I think that's a key message for all of us to take back out into our conversations. And I think you've done a nice job of capturing what those issues are. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And that count is the 3,000 striped bass memos I got the last 3 days over how we're really screwing things up. So appreciate that a lot. Other questions or comments before we get into the state perspective on this? Okay, seeing none, we're going to move into presentations on state-level policy and research activities. And I believe Massachusetts is going to be up first. So, Tony, and who's, you going to present from Massachusetts, Dan?
I guess so.
Okay. Mike said if you want to borrow his presentation, you could just say.
No. All right, so thank you. So this presentation covers obviously a very evolving situation for my agency, other partners, sister states, and of course the fishing industries. And it was prepared with a lot of assistance from folks back home who I wish were here today instead of me. The presentation does focus on DMF's involvement. Bob asked us, if you see the agenda, to present on state-level policy and research activities, so I'll do my best to focus on that. But we understand that we all have these common challenges that are going to create unprecedented and difficult to forecast outcomes. And as was earlier mentioned, it could be positive, it could be negative, but there's going to be clear impacts. So DMF has been dealing with wind for over 2 decades. The ill-fated Cape Wind project, which was slated for the donut hole of Nantucket Sound. And now it's difficult to see on the image, but the center of Nantucket Sound, while managed by Massachusetts under the Magnuson Act for fisheries, is not managed by Massachusetts for anything else. And so that was the reason that Cape Wind was plopped in the middle of the donut hole. But that project is no longer viable. And in these days, we have much strong support, legislative and executive branch support for offshore wind. State legislation was passed in 16 and 18, calling for substantial increases in wind energy. and there's 5 adjacent blocks right off of our coast, and they're licensed to the various companies: Bay State Wind, Ørsted, Eversource, Vineyard Wind, Equinor, and Mayflower Wind and Shell. Bay State and Vineyard Wind have been conducting survey activities. At this point, Vineyard Wind is the only company engaged in state permitting for their 84 turbines, with 2 offshore cables coming ashore. They're in the final stages of permitting. There are some appeals, but recently the legislature enacted a law to give private use of public lands to land the cable underneath a public beach. And that was our recommendation, to not go through an estuary, but instead come ashore on a public beach. Next slide. So the agency, as folks mentioned, Massachusetts has tried to get out ahead of this. We have been involved with the Intergovernmental Task Force going back 10 years, with some of these sightings of the projects was established. We have a Mass Fisheries Working Group on offshore wind, which is a forum to discuss issues with commercial and recreational fishermen. But what's interesting about that is we have a lot of out-of-state fishermen attending as well. So I guess this is sort of in the theme of trying to coordinate that even when you hold a meeting in New Bedford, fully a third of the folks who show up to your meeting come from out of state, because obviously out-of-state fishermen are impacted as well. Our program in Massachusetts back home we have a very strong habitat program run by Dr. Catherine Ford, and we're lucky to have her and her staff, and they're very busy making comments or providing reviews for state, federal, and local permits for offshore wind, and also giving us advice for scientific collection permits for the in-state baseline surveys. They would advise us on issuing letters of authorization for any kind of gear conflicts. So if the developer snagged some fixed gear, we obviously have to give some kind of permit for that. And as has been mentioned now numerous times by our federal representatives, we too don't have any staff dedicated to this, but we've asked up to 10 different staff to sort of reprioritize their activities to address these, and it is having a big impact on staff and our ability to do some of our other projects. So I'll just throw this up. You've all heard it, but obviously the challenges are the fishing industry concerns, that the wind farms are going to be off limits to mobile gear, as Eric just mentioned, the spacing. The industry have expressed strong concerns about cables being exposed due to weather and tides, cables needing armoring with protective hard and elevated mattresses that cannot be trawled over, and then potential future prohibition of fishing within the arrays. And the next concept that we keep hearing is there's safety impacts, navigational challenges within the array, and of course, if vessels are making decisions or restricted not to go into an array, the remaining areas that are open are going to become very, very crowded, and we could have some gear conflicts and crowding in the remaining open areas. That wind farms are going to increase costs of fishing. Fishermen fear inflated insurance costs. They fear impacts on fish and shellfish distribution and abundance. I found it really interesting what you folks showed earlier of the sand and the sediment plumes coming off of those turbines. That's really fascinating. And the question is, what effect is that going to have on pelagic life stages of some of these fish and shellfish? And of course, the increased fuel costs due to having to steam around a wind farm. And then, of course, there's the recreational fishery, which is a big wild card, because while we have some decent data about our commercial fisheries, it's never precise enough. The precision of our recreational data is far worse, so it's really difficult for us to go to a database and to forecast the impacts of what effects these arrays are going to have on recreational fishing. Next slide. So for fisheries mitigation, there are ongoing discussions with Vineyard Wind regarding compensatory mitigation for revenue losses. Obviously, that's a big challenge, trying to understand losses, trying to document prior fishing levels. We just don't have the granularity in the data to identify the exact locations of fishing, so that's going to be a future challenge. As far as mitigation and avoidance, in Nantucket Sound, we recommended that the laying of cable not occur until after the squid trawl fishery, which is for us a late April through mid-June period. So we recommended a summertime period for cable laying. We're also involved with maybe advising, overseeing the other Vineyard Wind funded studies. Vineyard Wind funded WHOI to conduct ocean atmosphere testing in the development area. Vineyard Wind has funded SMAST to develop a fishery survey plan and has hired SMAST to implement that plan, which involves drop camera surveys, trawl surveys, and eventless trap and larval surveys, and those surveys are underway now. And CZM is incorporating the seafloor data collected by Vineyard Wind to improve the substrate model used in ocean planning. And finally, Clean Energy Center was mentioned a few times, and they have been engaged in developing information and capacity in support of offshore wind. Obviously, it's one of their goals is to deal with the development on the New Bedford Harbor waterfront, developing workforce and supply chain, but also they've been funding marine mammal surveys going back 4 years, and future fishery studies are now being developed. CEC partnered with BOEM in Rhode Island on a $1 million fisheries research agenda. A request for proposal is being prepared and targeted for release in mid-August, with topic areas of habitat, fisheries resources, and compatibility of wind and commercial and recreational fisheries. DMF has been heavily involved in the scoping studies, and we can give a link to that report. And the steering committees include Rhode Island, New York, Mass, BOEM, and NOAA. So we've been working very hard to engage our sister states and our other federal partners to get out ahead of this. And then the regional coordination, that report is available. DMF also has an internal report. We've convened our staff to try to come up with the kinds of studies that CEC could study. For a while, there was about a $400,000 pot that I think has been increased to maybe twice that amount. And so we've made some recommendations there. And I think this would probably segue pretty well into the whole idea of ROSA, because the ROSA concept does make a lot of sense, because if we have $500,000 to $1 million to spend on some of these studies, it certainly makes sense to avoid redundancy, to make sure that it's all being done in a fashion that's comparable in terms of data collection methods. So that's my short presentation. I can take some questions and try to get some answers for you if I can't answer them myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think most of the states have pretty short presentations, so maybe we'll go through them, and if everybody takes notes down for the particular state question, that might be a quicker way to do it, but thanks. Good job. Rhode Island's up next, and Jay McNamee, I'm assuming you're going to let Eric do it?
Going to do it, Eric? I think I better. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Quick presentation here. Thanks, Tony. I'll try and cue you as we're going along here, too. So I thought there was a comment made earlier I thought was a really good one, and that is, as we start to discuss these things, they can be so contentious that kind of come off as being anti-green energy, anti-wind, and so we always like to state right up front that the state of Rhode Island DEM, we're supportive of offshore wind energy development in an effort to mitigate climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, along with the support, we also are committed to ensuring that local and regional environmental and socioeconomic negative impacts are accounted for and minimized. And so it's this concept of trying to coexist that we're trying to to support in this process. Next slide, Tony. So the following slides they're just kind of an itemized list of the things. Rhode Island has the first actual implementation of wind turbines off of Block Island. You saw a couple pictures of them in Andy's presentation there. And so we had this ability to kind of do this dry run on this, and we learned a lot. I think some of the lessons have been incorporated, but a lot of them haven't, and that's unfortunate. But all we can do is continue to try and contribute to this process. And so one of the things that, a couple of the things that Rhode Island has contributed so far, you know, with my agency, we're very focused on science, so we have tried to contribute best available science and data to understand the impacts of development on marine resources and the fisheries that depend on them. We've worked directly with offshore wind developers to make project siting and layout recommendations to minimize fishing and environmental impact to Rhode Island resources. So early on, we try and get involved to be kind of a intermediary between the developers and our fishermen, take their advice on how these things could work and bring them to the developers. Next slide, Tony. One of the things that we have done in particular with the Block Island, the Deepwater Wind project, the pilot project, was we reviewed and analyzed some of the survey information that was put together specifically for that project. So there was both trawl surveys and ventless lobster pot surveys that were done, lots of data that was collected. The initial surveys were set up in a BACI design, before and after impact assessment type of a design, and so a lot of that, we've put out a couple of preliminary reports. There'll be some final reports that we're trying to get published, so we're working on those now. There's lots of stuff to review, so we had a lot of submitted material from Deepwater Wind and National Grid, which was the energy distribution company that you know, was working on the Block Island wind project. But there's lots of surveys, so we think about fishery surveys a lot, but there are also EMF surveys and habitat monitoring and cable burial surveys, all sorts of stuff to kind of keep track of. Next slide. Another thing, we participated in trying to keep things organized in the state and making sure that there was good public processes with the stuff that was going on in and around Rhode Island. And so we have a local marine fisheries council, and we set up meetings between the developers and them so that our marine fisheries council could provide public input. We are working as a cooperating agency with BOEM during the NEPA permitting process. This was brought up in Dan's presentation, but we are serving on both the Rhode Island Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force and the New York IRETF. That's an acronym I just made up when I was putting together this, so feel free to use it. So, you know, there's all of these task forces that are developed, and we're trying to serve on those to the best of our ability as well. Next slide. We are serving on the New York Fisheries Technical Working Group, and then we're contributing directly to the creation of a regional collaborative to study the impacts of offshore wind development on marine habitats, fish, invertebrates, and fishing industries. This is something I'll maybe take a moment. So we found some money in the couch cushions, and this kind of gets to the point of the lack of organization that there is right now. We're all running around talking about the need for science, the need to get out before the projects start. And so we scraped up some money, and we're running around and could not figure out where to give our money because there's no kind of organized structure. And so in the end, because there were several options, I suppose, for Rhode Island. In the end, we chose the regional MASBOEM scientific data collection effort. We're serving on that steering committee, but that one was focused on fisheries, which seems to be the most immediate concern for our state. So we thought that we needed to kind of pull the trigger with this money, and that's where we ended up investing. But the point is, it's usually not a problem to figure out where to spend money, and it was hard in this case because it's amorphous and there's no structure that exists yet for this sort of thing. We're participating in the ROSA Regional Science Framework to the extent possible. Next slide. And so that's all of the ways that we've been trying to contribute to this process, to invest, to kind of bring Rhode Island's resources into the process to help out. And during that process, we've produced a bunch of things, and I'll kind of step through those. I'll try to do so quickly, but you'll see there are a bunch of hyperlinks in the slides here, and so we've got a web page that we've developed where we've been parking this stuff, and we offer this stuff in an effort for our partners to take a look. If there's a template there that's valuable to you, it's online. You can go grab it. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to talk about it, because I think Rhode Island has been thinking about this and kind of participating in a pretty rigorous way to this point, and I think we've got a lot of stuff that might be helpful to folks who've not yet gotten really involved in this. So one of the biggest products that we put together was this vessel monitoring system analysis. And so there's a couple of caveats there that I'll skip over. You can read them as I'm yammering away here. But there was an initial economic impact report that was put out by the federal government. And almost immediately after it hit the streets, our phones started ringing off the hook. Their assessment of squid in the lease area is what I made in 2 weeks last year just on my boat, and that was supposed to represent the entire fishery for that area. And so we dove into that a little bit. What we ended up doing was linking together. The initial analysis was based solely on VTR data due to the standardized nature of it. There were good reasons why it was done, but what we ended up doing was linking together the VMS data with the VTR data and some economic information, and kind of cobbling those together to get a better sense of the impact in those areas. And from what I can tell, the industry at least was more satisfied with our numbers. Still thought they were low, but I thought they were better than that initial report. And so that report's out there. We've updated it a couple of times. That's available for you folks to take a look at. We've also done a spatiotemporal and economic analysis of the vessel monitoring system data within specific wind energy areas in the North Atlantic. So that was a more honed in version of what I just talked about, and that one's available online. Next slide. And that first one there, again, was an update of that same sort of analysis. And the second bullet there was now a very specific analysis that we did on just the Vineyard Wind construction and operation plan area. And so all of that's available online to you. And these reports were used by developers and all sorts of folks during the process for Vineyard Wind in particular. Next slide. This is just put up there. I won't go through all of the comment letters that we've produced so far. There are 8 noted there. They're in blue underlined because those are all also available on our webpage. But the point of putting that up there is there's lots of stuff to comment on during this process, and these aren't kind of quick, bang it out in a half an hour type comment letters. It takes a lot of research. As I think it was Andy mentioned in his presentation, there is research out there. It's, you know, given the amount of time that there have been wind farms out in Europe in particular, there's not a ton of research, and there's not much at all for our area and for the species that we care about. But you know, you do the best you can. It takes a lot of research, takes an enormous amount of staff time to develop these comment letters. Thanks, Tony. We've done some research as well. So we were the principal investigator on a project called Understanding Marine Resource User Response to Ecological Impacts of Offshore Wind Energy. We did that as a case study, and that was kind of a social science research that we did. We were co-PI on a project called Values of Recreational Boating Activities associated with the Block Island Wind Farm, and an investigator on impacts of the Block Island Wind Farm on recreational fishing. And so a lot of these are in various stages of publication. I don't know if any of them are, one of them might be out, but in any case, we've done a bunch of research. We're happy to share that to the extent we are able. Getting close to the end here. This is next slide. That's just a link to our offshore wind webpage. So all of the stuff I've been walking through, the stuff that we're able to, we've got posted. And so I've got one more slide. I just want to note and just emphasize some of the things that, you know, others have said already, and I've got one staff member, Julia Livermore, extremely talented, very hard worker, you know, really industrious, creative, every good thing you should want in an employee, and we've got her maxed out on this stuff. She works on this stuff, again, just like all of you, very limited resources that we can use to deal with this stuff. So we've got her maxed out on this stuff. She's all of the things that I just went through. She created those. We come in off the bench and help her out. I would be one of those bench players, a couple of other staff to kind of support her. But again, it's such a challenge, and you have to devote these resources onto this stuff. And just for folks who haven't yet gotten very strongly involved in this, just it takes a lot. There's a lot to contend with, a lot of obligations that you've had that you have not factored into any of your strategic planning or your budgeting, just so you know. So I just wanted to sum up. These highlight that even in its infancy, the projects are large, complex, and rife with interactions with our fishing industry. Navigating this process is difficult, but it can be easier if it's done right and initiated early. And so with Deepwater Wind, we were really invested with that company. They communicated with us right from the get-go. We got research started before there was even a thought of putting turbines in the water. So we were able to kind of create that before and after impact design. We had much more of a challenge when it went full scale with the Vineyard Wind project. So that was a much bigger challenge for our state. And as I mentioned, I felt like a lot of the things that we created in that pilot project, the template, those weren't picked up on or followed. So we hope others can learn from the things Rhode Island, what we've done and produced. It's all available for folks that want it. We are available if you have questions on any of it. And so that is it for the great state of Rhode Island.
Thanks very much, Jake. Very good. And now, Justin, you're going to do Connecticut.
I'm wondering, we're 15 minutes overdue for our 2:45 break. Do we want to take a quick break before we continue on?
Well, we actually started a half hour late, so
all right.
We'll finish this, and then I think we'll take a break.
I tried, everybody. Good. Sorry. All right. Well, I thought I considered titling this presentation "What I Did on My Summer Vacation," because echoing the theme around the table here, myself and some of my staff unexpectedly spent a bunch of our time dealing with offshore wind issues this summer, as I'll describe a little bit as we go on here. So Connecticut is currently in the process of conducting our third solicitation for offshore wind proposals. In 2017 and 18, DEEP conducted 2 solicitations and selected 2 proposals, both of which went to Revolution Wind. And in 2019, a bill was passed by our state legislature requiring DEEP to conduct one or more solicitations to obtain up to 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030, I believe is the date. So if I understand it correctly, I think that 2,000 megawatt number equates to about 1/3 of the households in Connecticut. So it's potentially a huge chunk of Connecticut's energy demand. As part of that bill, DEEP was required to conduct one solicitation in 2019. Bidders on those proposals are going to be required to submit a proposal for at least one project for up to 400 megawatts. Next slide. So the RFP, or request for proposals, for that offshore wind development, the draft proposal was released on July 1st, and there was a 2-week public comment period which closed on July 15th, and the final RFP is scheduled to be released on August 15th. Next slide. What was sort of different about this time around, this third offshore wind procurement for Connecticut relative to the previous 2, were some of these requirements that were put into the bill that directed DEEP to do this solicitation, and I've highlighted this one down here at the bottom. The previous 2 solicitations, RFPs, did not include a requirement for an environmental or fisheries mitigation plan, but this one does. So next slide. The bill created this group called the Commission on Environmental Standards, and I've put an excerpt up here from the public notice that went out about that commission, but essentially this group was formed to advise our agency on what elements should go into that environmental and commercial fisheries mitigation plan. This group is comprised of commercial fishermen, academics, folks from NGOs and environmental organizations, and state lawmakers. And basically this group was convened and directed to essentially put together a report to inform the agency on the elements that should go into the commercial and fisheries mitigation portion of the RFP that's going to go out on August 15th. Next slide. So this commission's work has been proceeding at a breakneck pace. On June 7th, our governor signed the law, signed the bill into law, and the commission met for the first time a week later on June 14th. You can imagine my surprise and delight when I showed up to the meeting and found out that I was going to be the lead facilitator for the commercial fisheries mitigation portion of the commission's work. So at that first meeting, the members of the commission were split into 2 subgroups, one that was going to work on the environmental mitigation piece, one was going to work on the commercial fisheries mitigation piece, with a recognition that there was obviously some overlap between the concerns of those 2 groups. Agency staff, such as myself, are involved with the commission, but our role is as facilitators to essentially help the commission do its work, to take the notes and help put together the report, but we are not sort of active participants in the commission. So on June 14th, we had our first, sorry, Tony. June 14th, we had our first meeting. On June 21st was the deadline, 1 week later, for information to be submitted for consideration by the commission. So there was a public comment period. On July 10th, our subgroups had to report back on our recommendations, and on July 17th, so a little over a month after the formation of the commission had to release a draft report for public comment. The public comment period closed about a week later on July 25th, and then August 7th, yesterday, the final report was released to the public. That report is available online. The link for it is like really long, so rather than putting it in here in the presentation, I'll just offer that I could forward that out to the group after this meeting. Next slide. So what I've done here, I've got some slides here that just summarize some of the important recommendations that were in that commission report. And again, I'll just emphasize that our agency's role on this commission was as facilitators. The report produced by this commission does not necessarily reflect the opinions and positions of our agency. but this report will be used in internal deliberations to decide what will be in the RFP that goes out on August 15th. One of the recurrent themes around the table at the Commission was the concern that it is really difficult right now when we're at ground zero to predict all the possible impacts that might happen from offshore wind development over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and to recommend best management practices to deal with those impacts when we don't know what they are yet. So this idea rose to the top in the Commission's work, was the need for a developer to commit to an adaptive operational plan. And the idea here is that the developer would commit to sort of an ongoing monitoring and study effort and be willing to periodically undertake course corrections to mitigation that's going on. So if some impact was discovered that wasn't anticipated, the developer would be willing to take a step back and potentially change how they're operating or potentially devote more funds to mitigation. Next slide. The Commission also recommended that developers should set aside some money up front for a mitigation fund in anticipation that some impacts will be unavoidable and monetary compensation will probably be required. There was an emphasis on the fact that the funding source for this mitigation fund should be separate to that funding source that would support activities pursuant to that adaptive operational plan. So essentially the money for ongoing monitoring and study should be separate from this upfront mitigation fund. Next slide. There was also a lot of concern around the table about decommissioning, that there's a lot of focus right now on the front end of this process, but that 20 years down the road when it comes time for decommissioning, all the folks around the table wanted assurances that there would be a good plan in place and that there would be a funding source for the decommissioning activity identified up front that would be guaranteed to be available down the road when it came time for decommissioning. Next slide. A large part of the Commission's report dealt with wildlife risks. So that was broken out into 3 different components: an assessment and monitoring plan, an avoidance and mitigation plan, and a data reference and sharing plan. There's essentially a long laundry list of activities that the Commission felt the developer should undertake, including doing a full inventory of all marine species that might be in the development area, what potential hazards to those species there could be, what measures the developer would take to mitigate for those, and also for whatever ongoing study and monitoring activities were going to take place, the plans to make those data transparent, available to anybody, and shared with anybody who would want the data. I will mention that one of the real primary concerns here, something the Commission spent a lot of time talking about, was the impacts of sound, particularly to marine mammals, particularly to endangered North Atlantic right whales. Next slide. And finally, a section of the report deals with hazards to navigation and safety at sea and interference with fishing operations. The Commission felt strongly that the developer should assess hazards to commercial fishing vessels operating around the wind arrays and should provide information about planned turbine orientation, east-west versus north-south, the planned spacing between turbines, plans to develop transit lanes, any potential interference with safety at sea and rescue operations. And so there's sort of a long list in the report of things that the Commission felt the developer should address in their proposal. And finally, there was also a recognition by the Commission, as has been discussed around the table already today, that offshore wind development has the potential to seriously impact federal fisheries assessment surveys, and that the developer should work collaboratively with the National Marine Fisheries Service to determine what impacts there will be and help mitigate for those. I think, is that my last slide? Yeah, so really where this stands right now is the Commission has finished its work. It's issued its final report. That report is being taken under consideration by our agency in developing the RFP that will go out on August 15th, so a week from today. I will say that one of the themes that's come out of internal discussion so far is the recognition that this is sort of a regional issue, as has been discussed already today, and the need for a regional approach to dealing with the impacts of offshore wind development. And also, I was joking around a little bit about the burden that this has placed on our staff this summer and working on this group, but I do think it is a worthwhile investment of our time. Our commercial fishing industry has a lot of concerns about offshore wind development. There's a lot of concerns from NGOs and environmental groups on the potential impacts to wildlife. So this is a good investment of our agency's time and working on this, but we do have concerns going forward that this work is probably only going to proliferate. Right now we have 3 staff, myself included, who are spending some amount of their time working on offshore wind issues, but we don't have any dedicated staff. So I think it's going to be an increasing challenge for our agency to keep up with this as it goes forward.
Thanks, Justin. I'm hearing that common theme. Everybody's got 3 staff that have other jobs. So, okay, I think next one is New York, and I'm going to do that because I have 3 staff and they're not here. They're working on other stuff. So, Tony, if you could bring that up. Just a little bit of background on New York thing. It's just our structure. So, the counterpart to BOEM is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So they're the lead for this, that essentially are pushing offshore wind. And then for our authority, Department of State in federal waters under CZM essentially have the legal authority in terms of actions under there. And then my agency, DEC, when we come back into shore. So any of the things, the cables coming through or impacts into coastal waters, whatever, will be under us, DEC. But again, we're limited to the shoreline 3 miles out and any of the land-based things that go on. So we become more of an advisor to NIMS to advise maybe what's going on offshore. Just so you know, a few years back when we got into this, NYSERDA, the parent, essentially did an offshore wind master plan, and recognizing the need for widespread collaboration on individuals and entities who have technical knowledge, so on and so forth, about the offshore wind effort. And essentially that master plan identified job and supply chains, commercial, recreational fishing, essentially all the issues that were going to be coming up if we were to pursue offshore wind. Next slide. And of course the slide you've seen many times before, but from the regional approach, New York's market research spans from the Massachusetts lease area through New Jersey. Just 2 weeks ago, our governor announced we're up to 9 gigawatts. That was a commitment. I think we started out at 2,000 megawatts, and it was going up and up. So we're up to a 9 gigawatt commitment that's into the year 2030. And again, our stakeholders don't follow state lines, and the New York State collaboration is appreciated by the industry because we found out. Only a few years ago I said, well, those guys in New England are building wind towers. I don't care about those. But then it turns out all of our fishermen have to get back home from the eastern side of that, and transit lanes became a big issue. How do we get back? Safety for, boats at sea and so on and so forth. And as you can see on this map and the broader map that the BOEM map, it's like we're essentially taking a lot of areas of the ocean right now that are going to have wind towers on them. Next slide. So the way New York went about it was actually a couple of technical working groups. So, and I hate this acronym, but they call it the FTWIG. The other one's called the ETWIG, but it's Commercial Fishing Technical Work Group. The goals of this were to development of fisheries BMPs, identification of research need, improve understanding of impacts to commercial fishing, and improve communication between developers and the commercial fishing industry. This was led by DEC and NYSERDA, and so we've had a pretty active role in this, but again, we're one part of the whole NYSERDA effort. And there's a website that was set up for that essentially is trying to connect the issues of the fishing community, whatever, and this was before ROTA and ROSA, so it was an early version of that. The mission statement for the FTWIG was to provide advice and guidance to help steer the state's effort to advance offshore wind development in an environmentally responsible way, while also protecting the state's and region's valuable fisheries and fishing communities. We've been heavily involved with some of the sightings of these things to try to identify where fishing is occurring. And I think the first offshore areas are broad sections of that, but there's a lot of work to be done now because as they fine-tune these things, we really got to figure out where's maybe good or bad places to be putting the turbines. Next slide. And just a flow chart of the way this has been working under the FTWIG membership. We have key stakeholders, which you can see up on the upper left. We have the developers, federal agencies, and we have regional state agencies, and then technical facilitation and reports. So essentially trying to organize and channel all the information into one place. And it's been pretty successful in terms of, I guess, communication. It's just been, again, as you've heard in the common theme, is that I'm sending, quite frankly, my assistant director, who's my chief financial officer, has spent 60% of her time going to meetings on this, and I got to worry about the money of the place. So it's just not dedicated staff to really lead this thing. So I have one person right now that's essentially the FTWIG member for New York. Next slide. The highlights to date, there's been meetings in the fall of 2018, the summer of 2019. We've got a website to distribute information related to offshore wind and the fishing activities. We have a mapper tool that we've put out and have been working, like everyone else now, with ROTA to hold the first commercial fishing transit workshop for the New York Bight, which was done in spring of 2019, and I think that was pretty helpful. Other highlights today is working with the winning bid teams to discuss evolution of the fishing mitigation plans, winning proposals from NYSERDA for fishing research solicitation, and that will be discussed, and future research needs will be evaluated. We got $2 million for 5 projects, and I won't go into the details of them, and continuing the conversation of commercial fishing transit within the New York Bight. We're also working on inclusion of the fishing communities from regional, state into the jobs and supply chain databases. The additional state efforts related to offshore wind have been fish and fishery studies as part of NYSERDA's offshore wind master plan. Fisheries mitigation plans were required as part of New York State's first offshore wind solicitation put out by the Public Service Commission, and this requirement will also be for the future offshore wind solicitations. DEC is funding a species distribution model for sea scallops in the Mid-Atlantic Bight through the University of Maine. I noticed that you guys are doing stuff in Massachusetts and using Staten Island and New Jersey. We're using Maine. That's pretty interesting. New York State has expressed interest and support for the need for regional research and monitoring of fisheries and offshore wind interactions, so that ROSA looks like it might be maybe a good solution for a lot of this. The other group we've got, and this goes more to the larger environmental issues, but still in Mike's shop, is that the ETWIG, the Environmental Technical Work Group, and this is identification and prioritization of research needs, regional coordination, and development of wildlife best management practices. This one's led by NYSERDA, but I have my other staff full-time on that, and she's got another full-time job. Just a flow chart of this is that we've got the key stakeholders, which are a lot of the enviros, all the regional state agencies feeding into that, federal agencies, and the offshore wind developers. So again, trying to coordinate all the information and get it out in a place where everybody can communicate better. And the highlights of this is the State of the Science Workshop. Wildlife on offshore wind was in November of 2018. That's when I found out there's bats 40 miles offshore. I never knew that. So, synthesis of monitoring and mitigation practices and creation of public interactive tool for use in discussions around environmental mitigation plans, gathering stakeholder feedback to instigate development of an environmental research-related regional funding entity, stakeholder feedback on environmental research needs, and initiating discussions around developments of BMPs at the project level and regional level for consideration in New York State procurements. Oops. Next slide. So the next steps, the second State of the Science Workshop, Cumulative Impacts, is going to be done in the spring of 2020. And we're continuing working towards establishment of regional funding entity for environmental research with a workshop in the fall of 20. All right. That's wrong. Anyway, special committees working towards BMPs for marine mammals and sea turtles and birds and bats for inclusion in future procurements, and work with developers to implement environmental mitigation plans. Establish project advisory committees for selected environmental research projects. Next slide. So just in summary, it started off looking at a couple of spots 4 miles off of Jones Beach not too many years ago. And that one went away because it was too small. And then the next thing, this mushroomed into all these areas that, from just a regional perspective, is quite a lot of the ocean. And then if you go back to Bowen's master plan that Mike started off with, you can see there's a significant amount of areas up and down the coast. We've again, just the biggest challenge we have right now is that the amount of resources that the state of New York has had to devote to this is pretty dramatic. As Tan had said before, or one of the other states, I've got about 10 people going to these meetings, but they all have full-time jobs, and a lot of the fisheries folk primarily are doing compliance requirements for either federal or state fishery plans. So we're getting to the point, do we want offshore wind or do we want fisheries closed down because I can't meet compliance requirements? So right now we've put together through the state of New York sort of a dedicated team, a master group that will essentially be dedicated to this with professionals that hopefully as more and more of these are coming down, we'll be able to address them. And again, as Jay had said, we are here supporting offshore wind renewable energy, but we want to make sure it's done right. We protect the other stakeholders that are out there, and again, not put up any roadblocks that may slow these down at some time in the near future. So on that point, I'm done. And last, in cleanup, is going to be New Jersey, and Joe Cimino all by himself at the end of the table. All up to you, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll edit this on the fly so that I don't spend too much time rehashing what so many others have said. Going last also gave you the opportunity to delete the coast-wide slide to prove Mike wrong. So this all kicked off for us in January of 2018 when our new governor, Phil Murphy, issued Executive Order 8. That order had the Board of Public Utilities and the Department of Environmental Protection noted that they shall take all necessary actions to promote and realize offshore wind energy off the coast of New Jersey with a goal of 3.5 gigawatts by 2030. So the Board of Public Utilities, acting as the lead agency with the tasks of creating a strategic plan, environmental modeling analysis, stakeholder plan, and dealing with the offshore renewable energy certificates that are involved in funding. The Marine Fisheries Administration first got involved a few months later when BOEM put out the call areas that you see here on this map. And if I don't want my commissioner to hit me, I will refer to those black outlines as the New York-New Jersey Bight call area. So we engaged in some, BOEM originally had asked for a single public hearing in New Jersey and a very short turnaround for public comment. Governor Murphy had put out a request to the Secretary of Interior to extend that comment period, and we, particular Marine Fisheries Administration, but DEP in general, worked with BOEM and put out 3 additional stakeholder meetings in New Jersey. And I will say this, even though none of the other presentations have talked about it, but this certainly isn't something that we could take credit for. If you look at these areas, those large black areas were the original call areas. Following on the heels of that, BOEM was kind enough to put out draft wind energy areas. Those wind energy areas that you see here, darker green representing what they would suggest would be primary areas, lighter green, hard to see up there, would be secondary areas. If you look at that in conjunction with one of BOEM's staff members, Brian Hooker, created a relative use fisheries index. They really reflect quite well those primary areas with the least impact on fisheries. There were some trade-offs in there, particularly for New Jersey, so that most southern area, the light green that runs up the western side there, the most inshore area, that is prime fishing ground for New Jersey. We certainly did want to see that there, but that was a trade-off for the wind developers who would prefer that to the most offshore area, which is a secondary, even though that has the least amount of use. So just wanted to point that out. Next slide. Okay, so within DEP, you have a long list here of programs involved. This group has 1 to 3 members per group or division. Again, we have monthly meetings, as a lot of folks talked about, or meetings or calls as needed. You have folks like the first two up there, the Office of Permit Coordination and the Division of Land Use Regulation. Those are really our coastal zone management experts and the folks that we're filtering a great deal of our DEP responses through. I think, for a lot of the states, especially since all of the leases occur offshore, the state influence comes in the form of that Coastal Zone Management Act and dealing with federal consistency reviews. You'll see some of these, the State Historic Preservation Offices and Green Acres, which is within DEP, that purchases land to set aside for either environmental conservation areas or for other state uses. Their involvement comes in, and one of the other states that talked about this, as these transmission lines are proposed to be coming ashore in New Jersey. Some other states already have experience with this. There can be impact to state beaches, state historic sites. So there's a great many individuals and organizations within DEP that are involved. I think, as far as the concerns that we deal with, I think Andy did a fantastic job in his interactions with NOAA Fisheries missions, covering all of our concerns. So again, I won't rehash that, but with this wide breadth of DEP, all of those items are stuff that we are dealing with. Next slide, Tim. Okay. Shifting maps on you here, you'll see the call areas again, along with some other colored maps. These are areas that are already leased. So New Jersey DEP's role in this is to collaborate with BPU, advise on the environmental and permitting issues, working on the NEPA process review, when and where it kicks in. Again, also reviewing the Board of Public Utilities strategic plan, which is in the process, their environmental modeling. We've not only provided comments, but data sources for that, and comments on the OREC applications. Within the Marine Fisheries Administration, our role in federal consistency goes one step further, and that is also addressing, as Mike stated, MSA issues and Marine Mammal Protection Act and stuff like that. Again, particular to the Marine Fisheries Administration, we've done a great deal of outreach and stakeholdering. We're fortunate to have contact lists through our licensing systems and our registry for recreational fishermen. We have used all of those lists for any and all activities that have been asked to have stakeholders provide comments on. Within DEP, we have the working groups, one that I mentioned showing all participants from all of the different organizations. Within DEP, there's a multi-state offshore wind team that we participate in. We do have one New Jersey Marine Fisheries person that was on the FTWIG with New York. We have a BOEM New Jersey, New York, sorry, I should have actually put New Jersey first, BITE task force. And it says regional science entity, so I have to apologize to Andy and Peter because I think I'm the only one that didn't have a Rosa slide. But there were some other regional science entities being kicked around early on. Next slide, Tony. And then the question on the agenda was, where are we now? So now, when I first got into this, the comments on the call area seemed complex, but really it's much more complex. Since we have several ongoing leases off the coast of New Jersey, each in a different stage, our need to respond to these is different within each portion of this timeline. I only have 3 highlighted here. 2 as they get closer to the right side of the screen. When they put out construction and operations plans, they'll trigger the NEPA process. So again, 2 or 3 people from all of those agencies you saw listed within DEP. At one time or another, there's been at least a dozen Marine Fisheries Administration folks working on this, with one research scientist who had been hired and only on for a few months, Colleen Brust, who put this together for me, who has been working full-time on wind. And the reason for so many folks isn't just the complexity of this. The reason, unfortunately, is the incredible turnaround time for some of these things. There are occasions where, although a state may have 30 days for a turnaround time, of course, that by the time that gets down to my staff and needs to be approved back up through a governor's office, we may have a week to have a response put out. Next slide, Tom. As far as research conducted already, it really doesn't show up well, but there are, you can see a red and brown are 2 leases. There's a light green area around that off the south central New Jersey shore. New Jerseyans are not happy. I just made up a new region, but so that area had a 2010 baseline study that was funded by New Jersey DEP, led by the Division of Science and Research. That was a 2-year study, so for 24 months, there was shipboard, aerial, and passive acoustic surveys done, looking at avian, fish species, the fisheries that are out there, marine mammals and sea turtles, as well as collecting data on physical parameters for those areas which were our first 2 leases off our shore. That larger red area is the area that is now undergoing environmental modeling analysis. Again, that is being funded by our Board of Public Utilities, being reviewed by and having comments and data input by the New Jersey DEP and Marine Fisheries Administration. So I'll leave this here, but really, Tony, this is, again, a lot of this is just a rehash and nowhere near as thorough as Andy, so I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. I think what we're going to do right now is maybe take a 10-minute break so everybody can wake up again, and then we'll come back. We'll start with some questions, and then we're going to, after that, hear from Annie Hawkins about ROSA and ROTA, although we've mentioned so many times. So come on back about 3:45. Thanks. Why don't you grab your seats and we'll get back to it. Because Eric Reed's talking to Mike, and that could be forever. Okay, definitely a lot of common themes among the states and the federal overlap. So let's just open it up for questions or comments in general, or you know, or to the specific states, whatever. So anybody have questions or comments? Bill.
Thanks, Jim. So earlier I mentioned the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and I mentioned it in the context of a potential resource for states to have available to them in the future for funding some of the work that's going to need to be done by these projects. And so a little bit more detail. It's Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's HR 3742. It was reintroduced on July 12th, so very recently. It's got over 100 co-sponsors in the House already. Now, this effort was the product, for those who aren't familiar with it, was the product of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, who had established a panel that was composed of folks from states, but also a large component of members from industry and from NGOs. And the intent of it was to solve and address the difference between what needs to be done to conserve wildlife in the broad sense, and that includes fish, across the U.S., and to basically bridge the gap between what needs to be done and what the capacities of the states in particular have to do that work currently. The solution that came from that was largely pushed by the energy sector, both renewable and conventional energy. And their solution was to tap into sources of funding, specifically offshore lease revenues, to fund those through, and I don't have all the details here yet, but to fund those through an off-budget account, and to make those monies available to the states. And the argument that the energy industry put forth is that they're putting in between $13 and $14 billion per year into the U.S. Treasury, and in essence getting nothing out of it. And what they wanted to see was 1.3, and it's now 1.397 billion per year, go to the states to enable them to address issues associated with endangered, threatened species at the federal and the state level, to address habitat issues at the federal and state level, and in particular to address those issues as they would pertain to energy projects, so that those projects can be facilitated and done and achieved in a timely manner that's both protective of the environment and recognizes the industry's need to move forward expediently. So there is a tremendous nexus between what we're talking here and that potential source of funding in the future. And so I bring it up largely because I think that marine agencies in general have not been as closely tied to this effort maybe as they should have been. And then to encourage all of the marine agencies to go back to work with their directors of fish and wildlife, to establish ties and interests and express needs if those haven't been done in the past, and to recognize that the way this program is set to roll out at the state level, if and when it gets passed by Congress, is through the state wildlife action plans. So in order to facilitate marine involvement, they would have to have a role in those state wildlife action plans. My understanding is most do. And again, my understanding is that this type of work that we're talking about here ties in exactly with what those funds were designed for, and what the biggest and some of the largest and strongest proponents of that legislation intend for those monies to go towards. So I think there's an opportunity here, but I suspect that in order to take advantage of it, the administrators of the marine agencies are going to have to make a concerted effort to build those ties going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's great info, since I know my agency and other ones are structured. Marine is completely separate from Fish and Wildlife, but clearly we need to coordinate with them. So, other questions, comments? Justin Davis.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm wondering, certainly our state has taken advantage of contract employees through Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to accomplish certain tasks. So we have contractors who work on the APIS survey. We also recently developed an electronic data system for our trawl vessel and had a ASMFC contractor that we brought on to help get that work done. And so what I'm hearing around the table is this common theme of state agencies needing resources and manpower to devote towards this topic, not having enough people on staff, not having devoted folks on staff. I'm wondering if one approach might be for the states to, perhaps kick in some funding. Perhaps there's a funding available from the commission to hire contract staff who could work on these issues and benefit all the states, all the commission members, as one potential avenue to sort of address this shortcoming that all the different agencies don't seem to have the manpower they need right now to deal with this.
you want to respond, Bob, since I already have somebody sitting in?
One scenario is easy. You know, if there's funding available, we're happy to sort of take that funding in and hire folks and either have them sit in our office and help you folks out, or sit in your offices and help you out. You know, that part we can do. We do a lot of that sort of, you know, taking in money and contracting folks that are out in the States, or even making them ASMC employees if that works better. You know, as far as commission funds available to support this, you know, we have not set aside anything in this year's budget. We can, you know, have a conversation at the executive committee to see if we can find anything, but I don't know of any, you know, long-term sources of funding to hire, you know, a significant number of folks right now. But if there are, you know, if there's the ability of pools, or, you know, states to pool some funding, or however whatever that would look like, we're happy to be part of that and help out if we can.
Thanks, Bob. And full disclosure, actually one of the two staff I have is a contract employee through the commission, so it's a good way to do it. Jake, any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I think we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is the fishing industry engagement in research and development. And Annie Hawkins is going to do a presentation for us. Annie's Executive Director of ROTA and Interim Director of ROSA, or if I get that right, you can correct me, but go ahead.
Close enough. It's sorry, and I apologize, I'm a little sick, but the good news is I do not have a lease, or a slide with the lease areas on it, so we can skip that one for once. So I think that, you know, I've presented to the commission before last fall a little bit when we had first set up ROTA and we're starting to envision ROSA. I've certainly spoken at both council meetings. I think pretty much everyone left in this room is pretty well versed in the basic concept, so I don't want to spend too much time with that given how late in the day it is. But I will just do sort of a brief overview and then updates of where we're at and where we're going. So, okay, so our membership is growing constantly. We now have about 160 members, which consists of about 30. About 30 associations, processors, and fishing companies, and about 125 individual vessels, North Carolina to Maine. We've had folks on the West Coast reaching out who are interested in having ROTA expand out there, given that they're, you know, roughly equivalent to a couple years behind us in the leasing process. Even though some of the issues on the West Coast are different, they want to be able to sort of learn from experience and be able to share experiences with us. So that's something we're considering. We have, since I last spoke with this group, we signed a memorandum of understanding with NIMS and BALM. I think NIMS talked about it. It came up in, you know, Andy talked about it. It came up in some of the presentations. So the gist is that it just leaves open a door for cooperation and working directly together with the two agencies to engage the commercial fishing industry, their knowledge, their participation, to look to ways to improve the process and work towards regional research and monitoring efforts. So a new thing since last time I talked to you guys or any of the councils is that we have gotten our joint industry task force up and running. The idea behind the joint industry task force is that there's still a very pervasive feeling that the communications between developers and the fishing industry participants are not great, probably improving, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, and where we're still hearing a lot of concern about people thinking, you know, from one side or the other, thinking that they've expressed something and it wasn't heard, or how can we improve the communication? And so the idea was to get together the two industries in a very nimble forum and something a little bit outside of the regulatory process, where to improve those communications and look for maybe creative solutions to some of the problems, having the industries work better together. We did meet in June 2019, and we identified principles in terms of reference. And next steps, the task force will be meeting quarterly. We're in the process of appointing fishing industry members to the fishing industry seats. There will be about 15 to 20 folks from fishing industry, again, open for Maine and North Carolina, and we're trying to find a group of folks that is broadly representative of different gear types, vessel sizes, you know, states, and all that kind of stuff. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the 5 largest leaseholding developers interested. We may have more joining in the near term. And we've got the At least one of our annual meetings will be open to the public, and we hope to be able to use that as a forum to get input more broadly from the fishing industry and from others. Like I said, we just had our first meeting, so I think there's still a lot of things open about how exactly these meetings and this is going to look. But insofar as a lot of the issues that come up in the state processes or federal processes or all of these meetings really are applicable broadly to the whole region and to all fisheries. We think this is a good way to increase efficiency, so that particularly for fishermen with federal permits or that are fishing in a wide area, rather than having to engage in the same conversation again with every single state working group. Some of these sort of big picture things, if we can knock them off, we can save everyone time and resources, and then leave the state groups for things that are much more specific to the states and the local issues. Next slide. Okay, so and then the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, which has come up a lot today. We're the proud founding partner. So our role is to coordinate the fishing industry participation in ROSA. And if I said close enough, I wasn't trying to be glib about my title for ROSA. The idea is to hire an executive director for ROSA as soon as possible, and have me go back to my day job of RODA. On the one hand, we've heard everyone here saying they don't have anyone working on this full time. I think me and Lane and I, who works with me at RODA, are probably the only two people that are working on this issue full time, but it's still only two people and a lot of work. So RODA needs some TLC. We're trying to get ROSA up and running as soon as possible. That said, the reason that we've spent so much time and resources and that this type of effort was so critical in the MOU and is so critical to the fishing industry is that it's to be able to set up a regionalized effort that has full participation and credibility from the fishing industry, which in a lot of these efforts, scientific efforts more broadly here is, as we know, doesn't happen very often. And so we can, actually I think that's in the next slide, so I'll get back to that. So ROSA, an independent organization dedicated to advancing regional research and monitoring specific to fisheries and wind development and the effects of wind energy development on fisheries and then their coastal and ocean ecosystems. We have 5 of the developers, the same 5 developers in fact, at this point sort of morally supporting ROSA, and NIMS as well morally supporting ROSA. Next slide. So yeah, like I said, a strong focus on cooperative research and fishing industry involvement. We've modeled the structure after other public-private science efforts like the SSCs for the councils, the North Pacific Research Board, the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. These are all groups that sort of look at these bigger ecosystem problems and try to figure out how to get the involvement of multiple different scientists and the affected industries and industry knowledge to solve huge problems like this, right? So the core abilities that ROSA will take on are to identify priority research projects and reduce duplication and study efforts, and to maximize the utility of data collected for various management purposes. So that if we're doing studies, someone's doing a study on something specific to offshore wind, but there's a way that can be integrated into a stock assessment at NOAA, great, let's find that out and use that to our advantage. The funding approach is looking to be a mix of unrestricted and restricted funds, so there's different ways to be involved with ROSA. So, clearly we're looking for support for the organization overall, but then there would be ways for states or other groups that are interested in funding research on fisheries and offshore wind to use ROSA as a mechanism to do that, but may still be able to sort of direct the project in order to increase the ability of everyone to cooperate. Next slide. So this is just very basically the draft organizational structure, where you see there's a small board of directors because it's a nonprofit. Nonprofits have boards of directors with fiduciary oversight, and then this executive council. Everyone here is familiar with the council process, and and you'll see this looks very similar, where you have the executive committee and then the research council and then the subcommittees underneath. That's not to say that it's directly identical the councils or the commission or anything like that, but it's a familiar process that, you know, works pretty well. So, next slide. We had the first meeting last week, about 50 people there. Generally, like we heard today, people are pretty positive about this. We need to finalize the structure and the level of participation, and be moving forward in the coming weeks. So we're just right now finishing the summary from that meeting and, you know, those final revisions to the framework, and then we'll hopefully be put out for the director. So I wanted to close a little bit with, you know, with the state's roles in ROSA efforts. The task force, you know, does aim to, like I said, to provide that sort of coordination between the state fisheries and offshore wind working groups, you know, maybe the federal best management practices where all of these things intersect and affect fishermen. You know, if this can be that same sort of convening factor, whereas the task force is not focused on fishery science, right? It's about everything from communications to vessel access to, you know, navigational issues, that kind of stuff. That doesn't fit under ROSA, then the task force can be the venue to coordinate some of those things and provide some communication and backbone to what's going on. So, and then ROSA obviously will be for regional coordination to reduce scientific uncertainty. And whereas right now, we, you know, as you just heard, this hugely impressive amount of work going on in every state, and the states are working together, they're talking to each other, but it's pretty informal for the most part. So, you know, I ended up with the questions, I actually wrote this before I looked at the agenda, and these are pretty much the same questions in the agenda to leave open, but, you know, we don't have any set way or goal, you know, with ROTA, with the task force, what we're doing with ROSA for the states to participate, because we're still, I think, trying to figure out what that ideal structure is for everybody. That some of the stuff can become overwhelming very quickly and duplicative very quickly. And so how can we sort of help out here to coordinate or play a role in making sure that we're moving forward with the information we're getting and with the communications and with actually starting to make differences and make things more compatible. I think that's it.
Thanks, Annie. Question for Annie? Well, should have put more sugar in the after. Well, thanks, Annie, and why don't you hang out there, because I think we're going to start getting into a discussion now about what we're going to do as we move forward. So, actually, Tony, do we have the questions that were on the agenda? Can we pop those up, because that might be helpful? Okay. While she's finding, what we want to do next is we want to have a discussion on coordination in state and federal activities and how we move forward with this. So it's actually, Bob framed out a few questions, which I'll read them while we're getting them. So this is the time to get some feedback. We'll start at the table, and I think we'll go to the audience at one point. So first off, would increased state coordination improve engagement in wind power development? And secondly, what is the best approach to ensure state coordination? Third, what is the best approach to ensure state, federal, regional council coordination? And then lastly, is there a role for ASMFC in state coordination or state-federal coordination? So if you can frame your comments based upon how you think would be the best way of moving forward, other than if you were king and someone gave you $1 billion and you could have all the staff you wanted, which isn't going to happen. So we're going to have to, I think, live with what we've got. So, okay, Joe Cimino, you're up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, we had talked quite a bit about Coastal Zone Management Act stuff, and each state handles that differently, and each state has different parties responsible, as Mike pointed out. So I think one great start that ASMC could help is maybe a workshop where the states and GARFO sit and talk about like where we see this going. And I know some states really need to look at making changes and address wind, which for the most part I assume CZMs are mute on it because they're newer. You know, some of the issues that we're looking at with cable burial may be very similar to, and I was talking to Bob about this, may be very similar to some of the other stuff that we've dealt with in the past. but a lot of those speak specifically to telecommunications cables. And so, you know, the question lies, are we able to apply those?
Yeah, good comment, Joe. And you're right, the CZM programs are very different, and I think they're sort of a dilemma in some of them in terms of their mission, because I guess developing wind energy, and then they're like ours, you know, the natural resource protection of it, sometimes they're sort of have an internal conflict maybe that they're trying to sort out right now. Other comments? Brian.
I had a question I think might be best addressed by Michael. On an ongoing basis, is the Bureau going to be participating with the Commission in the future, or is there not a role that they intend to play or connection between the Bureau and the Commission?
So I can't speak for BOEM. They have, you know, BOEM has over the last couple of years been very much engaged with the councils, in the commission too, right? I mean, little less. There have been several times where BOEM staff have come and given presentations to at least the fishery management councils. There have been kind of demonstration rooms where there's been information presented by the wind developers, I think with an intention of directly engaging with the fishing industry that attend the council meetings. So there has been a pretty good coordination with BOEM between the fishery management councils. As Bob said, less so with the commission. I would expect and hope that coordination on the councils would continue, and maybe we can improve the coordination with the commission. You know, my staff works very closely with BOEM staff, and through our wind team, which includes staff from the councils. I don't believe we have a commission staffer kind of in a full-time, you know, in a permanently appointed position on our wind team, but they are aware of our wind team meetings and do occasionally sit in. That's about as much as I can say.
Chair. Because I guess I'm just uneducated on, in terms of the ongoing obligation that BOEM can bring to the developers of these projects and how we can interface with BOEM to bring the concerns of the fisheries management to the developers to incorporate this into these larger projects that are going to be coming online. That's I don't know if there's a way to connect that, or if their participation will be ending as soon as leases are granted, and that's the sum of it.
So we didn't really speak about it too much because there's not a lot of detail around what it's going to mean moving forward. But in Andy's presentation earlier today, he mentioned the memorandum of understanding that NIMS has signed with BOEM and RODA. So, to the extent of that your question is about how do we make sure that the interests and issues of the fishing industry are front and center in front of BOEM, I believe that MOU creates a framework for RODA working with NIMS and BOEM to make sure that those issues are brought to bear.
Thanks, Brian.
I do appreciate everybody's presentation as well.
Julia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So clearly there's a lot of new teams and organizations that have been formed at various levels, and some of them have overlapping purposes. So I think kind of like coordination and making sure that there's not redundancies is really important. And also many of these teams and organizations have an important role in the fishing interests and potential impacts. And just thinking about all the groups that are out there and who's involved, it seems to me that maybe there's not as much engagement from the recreational fishing interests as there should be. Some of these groups seem to have it, other ones don't, and I think that's an important thing to consider in terms of making sure that the commercial and recreational fisheries are engaged early and often in wherever they should be. And I mean, they're both going to be impacted, obviously, in very different ways, but I think it's important that all relevant fishing interests are brought into the process and engaged.
Yeah, good point. From my perspective, but most of the recreational guys seem to be more positive about this because there's going to be structure in the water, and their first question is, are we going to be restricted from the towers? And they said no, other than I think you can't tie up to them. But then again, there's others that, the pessimists don't believe that. So, but the majority of them seem to be less concerned about it than the commercial side. But it's a good point. They need to be connected to it. Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, to your point, the one thing that the commercial industry and the recreational fishing industry have in common is the science. We're all driven by the same science. And, we've heard today, we've heard it before, science is going to be a huge problem. So we have some common ground. Tom Fode's not here to hear me say that, but we have common ground. But as far as looking at this list, would increased state coordination improve engagement? Well, it certainly will improve efficiencies in manpower and capital. There's no question in my mind. That's the answer to that. What's the best approach? To ensure state coordination, I don't think you can force that on any state, but I don't think anybody in this room thinks that working together on a common problem is a bad thing. As far as, what's the role of the commission? Well, we got all the states. The two councils have some of the states. ASMFC is more engaged in what happens on the coast, the direct interaction with the coast and the sea. And, like I said before, the extension cord's got to come in somewhere. And whether it's under the beach or through a salt marsh, ASMFC should be engaged in that. As far as the format goes, because ROTA is an industry-based organization, it would seem to me that ASMFC, along with the other two councils, should be engaged with ROSA for sure. That's the platform for improved science, and I think that's what we're talking about. The two councils are doing their best with the working group and supplying some staff, but they've got jobs. I think in this case, because we all are under the same financial stress and personal capital and real capital, I think ASMFC, as far as ASMFC goes, should partner up with ROSA and the other councils in a meaningful way, and the service, of course. Sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to leave you out, but that would be my suggestion. I don't know if through the councils, ASMFC as well, the NRCC, I don't know where that plays into this discussion. Maybe you get both councils and the commission and the NRCC is the same. I don't know if it's the same body or not, but you get all four of the management bodies. Which one's the best, I don't know, John, but that would be my suggestion. So thanks.
Thanks, Eric. So, and if the commission did get connected, it would really be through both the science, through, one for Pat's section, whatever, and then through Tony, because it would be two things we need to be connected with. So I would assume, right, Bob? Okay, John.
Yeah, we've talked throughout the day about communications and sharing of information. I learned a lot of stuff here today. I've been certainly following this, being from Massachusetts and New Bedford. So I wonder if there's a platform, not to tout it, but the New England Mid-Atlantic Council have a great website that has all the information and links to all the developers' information. So we really should have a location that things can be shared up and down the coast, and that exists now, but maybe through ASMFC or something else that an entity that, I mean, if you put those 6 or 7 presentations somewhere, that's really a valuable library to have for people. Hey, geez, we got this issue. See if another state is doing it. So even just without any meetings or anything else, just an online platform to share the information.
Yeah, good point, John. Other comments, feedback? Let me go to Annie, and now Dan McKiernan.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Quinn's statement, actually, and we've been trying to bolster the ROTA website, but it's hard for us with 2 people to keep up with, all the stuff going on, so that'd be great. I was going to say is, I also agree with Eric's comments about ROSA and the commission, taking a role in ROSA. That would be great. Another thing that we've come up against working with the states on the, fishing industry side is that every state has about 3 agencies that are working on this, right? Which keeps coming up, and it depends on the state. But we've heard everyone here that works for whatever the Marine Fisheries Agency is say, we don't have funding, we don't have staff, we don't have funding. We have these, whether it's coastal zone or energy, every state has some agency that's got a lot of funding for this, right? That's a problem, and the problem is that when we're approaching people on the fishing industry side and saying we need to work better with the states, we need better state coordination, we get kicked to the energy side, and frankly they don't get it because they're not fish people. They don't get fishery management, and that's fine. But so it's not, if there's something the commission can do or just the people in the room can do to, I know that it's hard within state agencies. It's not that people always get along, but just as sort of food for thought, if there's something the commission that could play a role, not just within the fisheries agencies, but how do you start to sort of rein in that bigger picture where you've got a pretty significant power imbalance with where the funding's going and how things are being determined.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. And as I said before, I know, and I can encourage all the states to do this, our energy agency, we are approaching them now to say, look, we need more resources to, help you do this, not to, keep you from doing it. So I think that's a good message. Dan?
Yeah, I've come to understand that Rhode Island hosts a interstate call monthly, which is pretty advantageous from my staff's perspective, and maybe something done at the ASMFC level, but in the same vein. I've attended the law enforcement committee meetings of ASMFC, and what I see there is these disparate individuals that come together and compare and contrast the challenges that they're facing, and there's a great information sharing. So maybe ASMFC could coordinate or take from Rhode Island and step it up a little bit with a staffer. I would assign our lead people on that and create a repository of information. So it would be 2-part. It would be sharing, but you can then upload things that are going on. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought, but we need to be careful because I think that's what started getting my staff a little crazy, was that there was so many calls that were going on. That's all they were doing. They were going from one call to another. So, and maybe the commission's a place to do that, but I think we need 1 or 2 calls, whatever, to kind of centralize that. But if we could do that, that might be, and it might be a good role for the commissioner. We'll have to talk about that. Other comments? Ed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of the New England states have gotten together with the CZM program. Staff have gotten together, and in our agency, recently the CZM program moved into the Department of Marine Resources, so we have sort of both of those pieces now, and we're collaborating fairly closely with the Governor's Energy Office. Certainly that increased state coordination, as Annie noted, is important. And I'm wondering, I've personally found a lot of benefit in understanding greater detail of how the CZM programs, which vary widely state to state, as we all know, in terms of their regulatory authorities and how they overlap with fisheries agencies or the energy agencies, whether they're part of a super agency or they're standalone. matters significantly, but also I found it really beneficial to be able to work with other state colleagues and understand how they've used their CZM program to address some of these issues, how they've thought about regulatory changes to better inform good decision making. Certainly in Rhode Island, a lot of work has been done on that front that's been incredibly informative to us. And I think that a more overlapping approach of the fisheries agencies with CZM might be a beneficial next step as well. Certainly makes the table bigger, but I think there's a lot of benefit and potential value there.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. Very good point. Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think all of what we've been discussing, they're all good ideas. I'll maybe just step back. I think something you said a minute ago, Jim, is kind of important, and this is how I've been viewing this, and that is there's this void of leadership to kind of coordinate this stuff, and so someone will try and step in and create something, and it'll have some legs, and it's good, but then because of the limitation of resources, you can only go so far, and then it's like, am I wasting my time here because I got like all this stuff I have to deal with, and that's my concern. I hope so. I think it's just one of these things that has to evolve, and I think that's what we're doing here. So we've had a couple of ideas, and we'll try these things out. And maybe if the call gets hosted by the commission, maybe that'll have some staying power and can get a little more formulaic as to when it's happening, and you don't feel like, oh my God, there's like 5 gazillion calls. I can't possibly keep doing this, and so you stop doing all of them. And maybe we're kind of circling around a solution here, and we'll collapse to it at some point. But I still feel like, in the end, there's no, we just need like someone with the resources to come in and lead, and then I think we can all kind of rally around that. Maybe it's Rosa. I don't, I'm hopeful for that, but that's what we truly need, is someone that can come in, kind of be that pivot point that we can all kind of rally around. And this was a good event to kind of learn a little more about, on the science side, Rosa, because that's a concern that I have in particular, because the science part of it, for me, is the most pressing. Like, there's turbines going in the water, and we need to get out and figure out what's there now. We got to get going. And so, I don't know, just some thoughts from, I'm really struggling with this, and it's because there's nothing to rally around. And once there is that, I think this will really pick up steam. I think we'll be able to be more efficient, to not have to kind of test different things out and fail, and try something new. So I'm just yammering at this point, but it's been a really challenging, really frustrating, because I don't know where to go. I'm ready to go somewhere, and I don't know where to go.
It's actually great points, Jason, because we can answer the questions up there, but the reality is you need some sort of leader or whatever, for lack of a better term. And if you've ever, part of my earlier career, the incident command system, it's like you need an incident commander and a whole structure for doing that, and this just lends itself perfectly. But who's the incident commander? And theoretically, it probably would be the federal government, because they're the greatest jurisdiction. But again, Mike's sitting here with his 3 people that were on the phone call back in May, and you could hear in their voices they're just so overstressed from just trying to do this in their regular job. So, yeah, hopefully we're going to get there, and that, I think, is the biggest point. And why we really maybe want to do this is to try to get to that point in the not too distant future, and get all of our leaders to essentially say, look, we need to work together and get some leadership on this, and not just keep running around to meetings and phone calls and wasting a lot of energy. So good points. Oh yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a lot of us are, I think, there's the risk, right, of meeting fatigue and phone call fatigue, and I know we've had a number of meetings and workshops on wind energy over the last 6 months. We spent a full day at the New England Council. We spent almost a half day at the Mid-Atlantic Council. We're spending a half day here today. There was the ROSA meeting last week. But I think, one of the things that I've noticed in a number of those meetings has been the need to cover old ground and make sure that everybody understands the structure and the process and the scope of the issue. And where I think there's real value in meetings like today, getting all of the states, particularly for the fish management agencies that are here today, is to get to the point where the next time we have a call, we don't need to rehash whose role is what and what are the authorities and what's the scope of the issue. I really appreciate all of the presentations by the states on your actions, what's happening in New Jersey, and Justin, what's happening in Connecticut that I wasn't aware of, and seeing what's happening in all of those states and understanding that as background and context for our future discussions. So yes, a lot of these questions are probably not going to walk out of here today with answers to a lot of these questions, but I think at least we've made progress in getting everybody up to kind of the same point of awareness and understanding to move forward.
Thanks, Mike. Tony Delarnia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a few comments from the perspective of a fisherman. In about 2005 or so, as a charter boat captain operating in New York Harbor, I found myself faced with the aspect of a company putting in tidal-powered electrical generators right in the stream of the East River, and to capture the energy of the tidal energy. Well, where would they cite them is where the tidal energy was the greatest, the stream, and the current was the fastest. Well, that also happened to be where striped bass love to feed, right? A nice, strong current. They literally put those turbines, well, they planned to put those turbines right on top of probably the #1 striped bass recreational spot in New York Harbor. And all of a sudden, I found myself faced as a single charter boat captain having to react to this proposal. And at the time, there were very few people that I could go to comment about this. And I felt as if I was a victim. And I'll use that term. I'm not afraid to use that term. I was becoming a victim of what was occurring. Well, lucky for me that I happened to be an experienced council member at the time, and I knew a little bit about the federal management process and the federal approval process, and so I was able to make comments to the agency, and all of a sudden, the developer said, who the hell is this Tony Delarnia? I was told by their attorneys that I actually put their project back about 2 years by asking certain questions and expecting responses and answers. But let me emphasize, at that time, I was one fisherman all alone. What's happening here is a lot different now. The states are realizing that there are energy companies that are going to be putting things in the water that are going to be affecting their fishermen. And while in 2003, 4, or 5, I forget after a while, I was all by myself, the fishermen today are not going to be by themselves. I see Rotor here. I see the state agencies here getting ready to answer questions. And so I'm very encouraged by what I see, because I hope that as we go forward, no fisherman ever finds himself in the position I was in 2005. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Joe Cimino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Something that Jay said triggered, I realized I forgot something earlier. He talked about the importance and getting out there pre-construction to do some survey work. It's hard to wrap our heads around the magnitude of all that's happening, but we talk very little about construction phase. We've mentioned several times about access issues, and recreational fishermen might not have access issues. During construction phases, everyone will have access issues. These could be extremely large no-go zones that, for survey work, you may lose 1 to 2 years in these areas, even if they are opened up post-construction. So I think just that alone at some point deserves some discussion.
Thanks, Joe. Other comments? All right, I'll go to the public now because I see some wisdom out there, although some of them are ducking down in their seats right now. But Patrick, why don't you come up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick Paquette, most of you know me. About 2 years ago, as I was paying attention to my normal Mid-Atlantic and New England Council and ASMFC routine, I started to watch this happen. And I recalled, as Dan said, a long time ago, we had a bit of an issue with this project called Cape Wind. And at the time, I can remember going into the Sandwich, Massachusetts high school and asking the Coast Guard, there was 300 to 400 people in this, and asking the Coast Guard, going, are we going to be able to fish them? And they couldn't answer the question, and at that point in time, the entirety of the Massachusetts recreational fishing community went against Cape Wind, and joined a whole bunch of other people under a group called Save Our Sound. Many years later, a couple of years ago, the National Wildlife Federation came and asked a bunch of us conservation-minded rec guys to sit down, Captain John McMurray, some other guys from New Jersey and New York, some guys from Connecticut, and some guys from Massachusetts, and we sat down and they said, what would it take to support offshore wind? How do you do it right? The guys from the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association had been dealing with Block Island already, and we called them in, and we had about 15 people on a group, and we came up with a set of principles. You all got a letter introducing that set of principles to you today. Tina was nice enough to print it, because I guess I sent it a little bit late. And a brochure of our project, Anglers for Offshore Wind, is outside. And basically our principles are just what the chairman said earlier. Access first, science, and public input. That those three things are absolutely necessary. And we've gone about our way with as little funding as we can get from NWF to try and make sure that at least some of the recreational organizations in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in Rhode Island have been able to participate and make comment and participate in the process. This is a wonderful discussion today, and I find it much more hopeful than the discussion I watched at the New England Council a few weeks ago down in Connecticut. And the reason is because there's more people talking here and talking about that big picture organization. That being said, a concern of the recreational community right now is where do we fit? There's some powerful national groups starting to pay attention. Thank God Mike Wayne from ASA is here. We've been trying to get IGFA to pay attention here. The Rota Rosa model, the industry model, is obviously a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily have recreational input. It doesn't have the third wheel of fisheries management. The environmental community is not there. And the more this meeting has gone on today, I keep going, every time we need a research project about something, and we have a problem figuring out where the money needs to come from different sources, it almost always ends up at ACCSP. Some great work and money managed through ACCSP. So I just wanted to make sure that that idea gets out there, because, you know, I'm sure that there may be some investment possibilities from people from the companies and from the industry that sells, you know, that has $50,000 in electronics on every one of those boats and every one of those marinas. Ask Rick Robbins what it cost for his boat, because his boat was built to fish in the areas that are on that map that you guys keep referring to today. The tournament structures of those. Is a big industry that feeds the offshore big game fleet. And don't make no mistake about it, there's a lot of economic impact there. And so we need to have a seat at this table, and it needs to be much more formal than our little Anglers for Offshore Wind group. So I hope that as this goes down, that investors, that the developers realize, don't pour all your money into just commercial industry groups, because you're going to have to account for the HMS part of it, which is sort of missing here. And it's obviously, this isn't the normal place that those people would be. And I realized that Brad McHale is way, like, got too much to do. But we look at the potential of Vineyard Wind as being the Northeast first offshore mahi-mahi farm. We're spending. I happen to serve in the Massachusetts Recreational Fisheries Development Panel, formerly chair of that oversees the spending of our license money, and we're spending upwards of $50,000 a year of our saltwater fishing license on permitting and building and trying to find the next offshore reefs. Recreational fishermen support the kinds of benefits that have some potential here if the science is done right and if the access is guaranteed, and the Coast Guard has made it really clear that we're going to be able to have access. They actually are questioning whether they have any jurisdiction at all, even for buffer zones. I encourage everybody to listen to the tape of the Coast Guard presentation at the New England Council in Connecticut. But anyway, please don't forget us, and please make sure that as these things like ROTA and ROSA and these kind of collaboratives are, they have to have even, equitable representation from all the stakeholders, including the recreational community. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Very good points. Jeff Deem.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Deem. I had the pleasure of working with Marco on the early stages of the Virginia offshore wind energy area, and I wanted to pass along some resources for you that might help your overworked staff get some information that they need. With Marco, we did a best management practices for the offshore wind area in Virginia, and it covered mitigation, interaction with the fishermen. So I think that would be a good place to get some of this information that you're after. BOEM had best management practices as well that are similar to what Marco had, so that might help you out. There are two other sources. The North American Clean Energy Organization puts out a monthly publication that follows wind and solar energy, but also ocean energy like offshore wind, tidal, and wave energy. It's a free publication. It's a great way to keep up with what's going on. I recommend that everybody that's involved with this get a copy of that or subscribe to it. And then the other is the Northwest Pacific National Lab produces a publication by email that is called TETHYS, T-E-T-H-Y-S. And they have white papers on everything to do with offshore energy. It can be wind, it can be electromagnetic fields from cables. You have to excuse, I got a hand tremor here. Underwater structures, how the fish interact, everything that you might want to know. And I don't know that they're peer-reviewed. I would think that they are, but it's a good place to get some information, save yourself some time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other comments from the audience? Okay, seeing none, we'll bring it back to the table. Any other comments? We're actually closing down on our 5 o'clock time, so we'll be ending soon, but we'll probably do a little bit of wrap up. But any other words of wisdom or thoughts of wisdom before we, Bob?
Probably not wisdom, but I'll talk anyway. It just listening to the conversation and thinking from the, strictly ASMSC role, what's our involvement? What does that look like? It seems like there's sort of three parts. One is the serving on the executive council, I think it is, of ROSA, executive something, committee, council, whatever it is. That we've got a seat set aside already in one of the sort of higher level committees at ROSA. So that seems to be one good step. The second is providing this forum and maybe expanding it to some of the coastal zone, agencies within the states at times. This is easy for the commission. We can provide a big table and put a bunch of people around it, and most of the states are already here, or all the states are already here, and there's fish agencies are here. So we can do that whenever the states think we need it. And then I think the third is getting back to what Justin said. If there's contracting or sort of money movement kind of things that we can do, we're happy to do that. If we can get some money, hire some staff, and park them in wherever, we're happy to do that. And I think if there are specific research projects that that people want to get started and they want to move money through us, I think that's fine as well. I think ROSA, once it's up and running, ROSA is probably the spot to do that. But that's sort of, they're still ramping up. So if there's something short term that maybe needs a home or a contracting agency, we can do that as well. So it seems to be, that's kind of the minimum role that probably makes sense for the commission. I don't, our vice chairman of the commission has this fear of scope creep, and that makes a lot of sense. But so I don't want to overcommit without him in the room anyway. That's for sure. And Jim, you can fight with Pat about that. But so I think those three steps that I mentioned are fairly minimal as far as staff commitment and resource commitment. So we can do that if that's what folks around the table think the commission at a minimum should do. If there's anything beyond that that makes sense as far as coordination or information sharing, repository of information, those sorts of things, we're happy to do that as well. The other point is the Commission's Habitat Committee has put together a habitat document on siting of wind power facilities, and I think that included bringing the power line back to the beach. So there is some information there that can be shared as well. So that seems to be kind of over the last couple hours, it seems to be what people are saying at a minimum ASMFC should probably be involved with.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think that's great. At least, we're starting to, as Jason said, this is going to evolve, but it seems to be getting more towards gelling than it was even 6 months ago. So I think that'll be a good help. Any other comments, questions before we wrap up? Bob, Mike, you have a summary? Any thoughts you have before we end this?
No, I'll just restate. I really appreciate Bob and his staff for organizing and hosting this. I think it's been really valuable, and I hope others share that perspective as well. And I appreciate everybody's time and sticking around for the last half of. I know it's been a very long and challenging ASMFC meeting. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And my last comment will simply be when I went to one of the meetings at the European guys came, some from Ireland at the Mid-Atlantic meeting, and essentially they were told, oh yeah, these guys are going to have full access to the fisheries and everything and be hunky-dory, and they kind of got screwed. So I think our success is going to be if we can at least have wind power and viable fisheries, and I think that'll be a success, and I think that is something we should all take to heart, and hopefully we'll be sitting here a few years from now saying we did a good job. So thanks again for everybody coming, and get home safe. Thanks a lot.